Welcome to Storytime Classics. Tonight, we present a collection of chilling ghost stories from one of the greatest masters of supernatural fiction, Algernon Blackwood. The Empty House and Other Ghost Stories, first published in 1906, is a haunting selection of eerie tales filled with restless spirits, mysterious apparitions, and psychological horror. If you enjoy classic ghost stories that send shivers down your spine, then prepare yourself for an unforgettable journey into the unknown. Now, let's begin. The Empty House and Other Ghost Stories by Algernon Blackwood. The Empty House. Certain houses, like certain persons, manage somehow to proclaim at once their character for evil. In the case of the latter, no particular feature need betray them. They may boast an open countenance and an ingenuous smile, and yet a little of their company leaves the unalterable conviction that there is something radically amiss with their being, that they are evil. Willy-nilly, they seem to communicate an atmosphere of secret and wicked thoughts, which makes those in their immediate neighborhood shrink from them as from a thing diseased. And, perhaps, with houses the same principle is operative, and it is the aroma of evil deeds committed under a particular roof, long after the actual doers have passed away, that makes the gooseflesh come and the hair rise. Something of the original passion of the evildoer and of the horror felt by his victim enters the heart of the innocent watcher, and he becomes suddenly conscious of tingling nerves, creeping skin, and a chilling of the blood. He is terror-stricken without apparent cause. There was manifestly nothing in the external appearance of this particular house to bear out the tales of the horror that was said to reign within. It was neither lonely nor unkempt. It stood, crowded into a corner of the square, and looked exactly like the houses on either side of it. It had the same number of windows as its neighbors, the same balcony overlooking the gardens, the same white steps leading up to the heavy black front door. And in the rear, there was the same narrow strip of green with neat box borders running up to the wall that divided it from the backs of the adjoining houses. Apparently, too, the number of chimney pots on the roof was the same, the breadth and angle of the eaves, and even the height of the dirty area railings. And yet this house in the square, that seemed precisely similar to its 50 ugly neighbors, was as a matter of fact entirely different, horribly different. Wherein lay this marked, invisible difference is impossible to say. It cannot be ascribed wholly to the imagination, because persons who had spent some time in the house, knowing nothing of the facts, had declared positively that certain rooms were so disagreeable they would rather die than enter them again, and that the atmosphere of the whole house produced in them symptoms of a genuine terror. While the series of innocent tenants who had tried to live in it and been forced to decamp at the shortest possible notice was indeed little less than a scandal in the town. When Shorthouse arrived to pay a week-end visit to his Aunt Julia in her little house on the seafront at the other end of the town, he found her charged to the brim with mystery and excitement. He had only received her telegram that morning, and he had come anticipating boredom. But the moment he touched her hand and kissed her apple-skin wrinkled cheek, he caught the first wave of her electrical condition. The impression deepened when he learned that there were to be no other visitors, and that he had been telegraphed for with a very special object. Something was in the wind, and the something would doubtless bear fruit, for this elderly spinster aunt, with a mania for psychical research, had brains as well as willpower, and by hook or by crook she usually managed to accomplish her ends. The revelation was made soon after tea, when she sidled close up to him as they paced slowly along the seafront in the dusk. "I've got the keys," she announced in a delighted, yet half-awesome voice. "Got them till Monday." "The keys of the bathing machine, or?" he asked innocently, looking from the sea to the town. Nothing brought her so quickly to the point as feigning stupidity. "Neither," she whispered. "I've got the keys of the haunted house in the square, and I'm going there tonight." Shorthouse was conscious of the slightest possible tremor down his back. He dropped his teasing tone. Something in her voice and manner thrilled him. She was in earnest. "But you can't go alone," he began. "That's why I wired for you," she said with decision. He turned to look at her. The ugly, lined, enigmatical face was alive with excitement. There was the glow of genuine enthusiasm round it like a halo. The eyes shone. He caught another wave of her excitement, and a second tremor, more marked than the first, accompanied it. "Thanks, Aunt Julia," he said politely. "Thanks awfully. I should not dare to go quite alone," she went on, raising her voice. "But with you I should enjoy it immensely. You're afraid of nothing, I know." "Thanks so much," he said again. Is anything likely to happen?" "A great deal has happened," she whispered, "though it's been most cleverly hushed up. 3 tenants have come and gone in the last few months, and the house is said to be empty for good now." In spite of himself, Shorthouse became interested. His aunt was so very much in earnest. "The house is very old indeed," she went on, "and the story, an unpleasant one, dates a long way back. It has to do with a murder committed by a jealous stableman who had some affair with a servant in the house. One night, he managed to secrete himself in the cellar, and when everyone was asleep, he crept upstairs to the servants' quarters, chased the girl down to the next landing, and before anyone could come to the rescue, threw her bodily over the banisters into the hall below. And the stableman was caught, I believe, and hanged for murder. But it all happened a century ago, and I've not been able to get more details of the story." Shorthouse now felt his interest thoroughly aroused, but though he was not particularly nervous for himself, he hesitated a little on his aunt's account. "On one condition," he said at length. "Nothing will prevent my going," she said firmly, "but I may as well hear your condition. That you guarantee your power of self-control if anything really horrible happens. I mean, that you are sure you won't get too frightened." "Jim," she said scornfully, "I'm not young, I know, nor are my nerves, but with you I should be afraid of nothing in the world." This, of course, settled it, for Shorthouse had no pretensions to being other than a very ordinary young man, and an appeal to his vanity was irresistible. He agreed to go. Instinctively, by a sort of subconscious preparation, he kept himself and his forces well in hand the whole evening, compelling an accumulative reserve of control by that nameless inward process of gradually putting all the emotions away and turning the key upon them, a process difficult to describe, but wonderfully effective, as all men who have lived through severe trials of the inner man well understand. Later, it stood him in good stead. But it was not until 10:30, when they stood in the hall, well in the glare of friendly lamps and still surrounded by comforting human influences, that he had to make the first call upon this store of collected strength. For once the door was closed, and he saw the deserted, silent street stretching away white in the moonlight before them, it came to him clearly that the real test that night would be in dealing with 2 fears instead of 1. He would have to carry his aunt's fear as well as his own. And as he glanced down at her sphinx-like countenance and realized that it might assume no pleasant aspect in a rush of real terror, he felt satisfied with only one thing in the whole adventure: that he had confidence in his own will and power to stand against any shock that might come. Slowly they walked along the empty streets of the town. A bright autumn moon silvered the roofs, casting deep shadows. There was no breath of wind, and the trees in the formal gardens by the seafront watched them silently as they passed along. To his aunt's occasional remarks, Shorthouse made no reply, realizing that she was simply surrounding herself with mental buffers, saying ordinary things to prevent herself thinking of extraordinary things. Few windows showed lights, and from scarcely a single chimney came smoke or sparks. Shorthouse had already begun to notice everything, even the smallest details. Presently they stopped at the street corner and looked up at the name on the side of the house full in the moonlight, and with one accord, but without remark, turned into the square and crossed over to the side of it that lay in shadow. "The number of the house is 13, whispered a voice at his side, and neither of them made the obvious reference, but passed across the broad sheet of moonlight and began to march up the pavement in silence. It was about halfway up the square that Shorthouse felt an arm slipped quietly but significantly into his own, and knew then that their adventure had begun in earnest, and that his companion was already yielding imperceptibly to the influences against them. She needed support. A few minutes later, they stopped before a tall, narrow house that rose before them into the night, ugly in shape and painted a dingy white. Shutterless windows, without blinds, stared down upon them, shining here and there in the moonlight. There were weather streaks in the wall and cracks in the paint, and the balcony bulged out from the first floor a little unnaturally. But beyond this generally forlorn appearance of an unoccupied house, there was nothing at first sight to single out this particular mansion for the evil character it had most certainly acquired. Taking a look over their shoulders to make sure they had not been followed, they went boldly up the steps and stood against the huge black door that fronted them forbiddingly. But the first wave of nervousness was now upon them, and Shorthouse fumbled a long time with the key before he could fit into the lock at all. For a moment, if truth were told, they both hoped it would not open, for they were a prey to various unpleasant emotions as they stood there on the threshold of their ghostly adventure. Shorthouse, shuffling with the key and hampered by the steady weight on his arm, certainly felt the solemnity of the moment. It was as if the whole world, for all experience, seemed at that instant concentrated in his own consciousness. Were listening to the grating noise of that key. A stray puff of wind wandering down the empty street woke a momentary rustling in the trees behind them. But otherwise this rattling of the key was the only sound audible. And at last it turned in the lock, and the heavy door swung open and revealed a yawning gulf of darkness beyond. With a last glance at the moonlit square, they passed quickly in, and the door slammed behind them with a roar that echoed prodigiously through empty halls and passages. But instantly, with the echoes, another sound made itself heard, and Aunt Julia leaned suddenly so heavily upon him that he had to take a step backwards to save himself from falling. A man had coughed close beside them, so close that it seemed they must have been actually by his side in the darkness. With the possibility of practical jokes in his mind, Shorthouse at once swung his heavy stick in the direction of the sound, but it met nothing more solid than air. He heard his aunt give a little gasp beside him. "There's someone here," she whispered. "I heard him." "Be quiet," he said sternly. It was nothing but the noise of the front door. "Oh, get a light. Quick," she added as her nephew, fumbling with a box of matches, opened it upside down and let them all fall with a rattle onto the stone floor. The sound, however, was not repeated, and there was no evidence of retreating footsteps. In another minute they had a candle burning, using an empty end of a cigar case as a holder, and when the first flare had died down he held the impromptu lamp aloft and surveyed the scene. And it was dreary enough in all conscience, for there is nothing more desolate in all the abodes of men than an unfurnished house dimly lit, silent, and forsaken, and yet tenanted by rumor with the memories of evil and violent histories. They were standing in a wide hallway. On their left was the open door of a spacious dining room, and in front the hall ran, ever narrowing, into a long, dark passage that led apparently to the top of the kitchen stairs. The broad, uncarpeted staircase rose in a sweep before them, everywhere draped in shadows, except for a single spot about halfway up where the moonlight came in through the window and fell on a bright patch on the boards. This shaft of light shed a faint radiance above and below it, lending to the objects within its reach a misty outline that was infinitely more suggestive and ghostly than complete darkness. Filtered moonlight always seems to paint faces on the surrounding gloom, and as Shorthouse peered up into the well of darkness and thought of the countless empty rooms and passages in the upper part of the old house, he caught himself longing again for the safety of the moonlit square or the cozy, bright drawing room they had left an hour before. Then, realizing that these thoughts were dangerous, he thrust them away again and summoned all his energy for concentration on the present. "Aunt Julia," he said aloud, severely, "we must now go through the house from top to bottom and make a thorough search." The echoes of his voice died away slowly all over the building, and in the intense silence that followed, he turned to look at her. In the candlelight, he saw that her face was already ghastly pale, but she dropped his arm for a moment and said in a whisper, stepping close in front of him, "I agree. We must be sure there's no one hiding. That's the first thing." She spoke with evident effort, and he looked at her with admiration. "You feel quite sure of yourself? It's not too late." "I think so," she whispered, her eyes shifting nervously toward the shadows behind. "Quite sure. Only one thing." "What's that?" "You must never leave me alone for an instant. As long as you understand that any sound or appearance must be investigated at once, for to hesitate means to admit fear. That is fatal. Agreed, she said, a little shakily, after a moment's hesitation. I'll try. Arm in arm, Shorthouse holding the dripping candle and the stick, while his aunt carried the cloak over her shoulders, figures of utter comedy to all but themselves, they began a systematic search. Stealthily, walking on tiptoe and shading the candle, lest it should betray their presence through the shutterless windows, they went first into the big dining room. There was not a stick of furniture to be seen. Bare walls, ugly mantelpieces, and empty grates stared at them. Everything, they felt, resented their intrusion, watching them, as it were, with veiled eyes. Whispers followed them. Shadows flitted noiselessly to right and left. Something seemed ever at their back, watching, waiting an opportunity to do them injury. There was the inevitable sense that operations which went on when the room was empty had been temporarily suspended till they were well out of the way again. The whole dark interior of the old building seemed to become a malignant presence that rose up, warning them to desist and mind their own business. Every moment the strain on the nerves increased. Out of the gloomy dining room they passed through large folding doors into a sort of library or smoking room, wrapped equally in silence, darkness, and dust, and from this they regained the hall near the top of the back stairs. Here a pitch-black tunnel opened before them into the lower regions, and, it must be confessed, they hesitated, but only for a minute. With the worst of the night still to come, it was essential to turn from nothing. Aunt Julia stumbled at the top step of the dark descent, ill-lit by the flickering candle, and even Shorthouse felt at least half the decision go out of his legs. "Come on," he said peremptorily, and his voice ran on and lost itself in the dark, empty spaces below. "I'm coming," she faltered, catching his arm with unnecessary violence. They went a little unsteadily down the stone steps, a cold, damp air meeting them in the face, close and malodorous. The kitchen, into which the stairs led along a narrow passage, was large, with a lofty ceiling. Several doors opened out of it, some into cupboards with empty jars still standing on the shelves, and others into horrible little ghostly back offices, each colder and less inviting than the last. Black beetles scurried over the floor, and once, when it knocked against a deal table standing in a corner, something about the size of a cat jumped down with a rush and fled, scampering across the stone floor into the darkness. Everywhere there was a sense of recent occupation, an impression of sadness and gloom. Leaving the main kitchen, they next went towards the scullery. The door was standing ajar, and as they pushed it open to its full extent, Aunt Julia uttered a piercing scream, which she instantly tried to stifle by placing her hand over her mouth. For a second Shorthouse stood stock still, catching his breath. He felt as if his spine had suddenly become hollow, and someone had filled it with particles of ice. Facing them, directly in their way between the doorposts, stood the figure of a woman. She had disheveled hair and wildly staring eyes, and her face was terrified and white as death. She stood there motionless for the space of a single second. Then the candle flickered, and she was gone utterly, and the door framed nothing but empty darkness. "Only the beastly jumping candlelight," he said quickly, in a voice that sounded like someone else's and was only half under control. "Come on, Aunt. There's nothing there." He dragged her forward. With a clattering of feet and a great appearance of boldness they went on, but over his body the skin moved as if crawling ants covered it, and he knew by the weight on his arm that he was supplying the force of locomotion for two. The scullery was cold, bare, and empty, more like a large prison cell than anything else. They went round it, tried the door into the yard and the windows, but found them all fastened securely. His aunt moved beside him like a person in a dream. Her eyes were tightly shut, and she seemed merely to follow the pressure of his arm. Her courage filled him with amazement. At the same time, he noticed that a certain odd change had come over her face, a change which somehow evaded his power of analysis. "There's nothing here, Auntie," he repeated aloud quickly. "Let's go upstairs and see the rest of the house. Then we'll choose a room to wait up in." She followed him obediently, keeping close to his side, and they locked the kitchen door behind them. It was a relief to get up again. In the hall there was more light than before, for the moon had traveled a little further down the stairs. Cautiously they began to go up into the dark vault of the upper house, the boards creaking under their weight. On the first floor they found the large double drawing rooms, a search of which revealed nothing. Here also was no sign of furniture or recent occupancy, nothing but dust and neglect and shadows. They opened the big folding doors between front and back drawing rooms and then came out again to the landing and went on upstairs. They had not gone up more than a dozen steps when they both simultaneously stopped to listen, looking into each other's eyes with a new apprehension across the flickering candle flame. From a room they had left hardly 10 seconds before came the sound of doors quietly closing. It was beyond all question. They heard the booming noise that accompanies the shutting of heavy doors, followed by the sharp catching of the latch. "We must go back and see," said Shorthouse briefly, in a low tone, and turning to go downstairs again. Somehow she managed to drag after him, her feet catching in her dress, her face livid. When they entered the front drawing room, it was plain that the folding doors had been closed, half a minute before. Without hesitation, Shorthouse opened them. He almost expected to see someone facing him in the back room, but only darkness and cold air met him. They went through both rooms, finding nothing unusual. They tried in every way to make the doors close of themselves, but there was not wind enough even to set the candle flame flickering. The doors would not move without strong pressure. All was silent as the grave. Undeniably, the rooms were utterly empty, and the house utterly still. "It's beginning," whispered a voice at his elbow which he hardly recognized as his aunt's. He nodded acquiescence, taking out his watch to note the time. It was 15 minutes before midnight. He made the entry of exactly what had occurred in his notebook, setting the candle in its case upon the floor in order to do so. It took a moment or two to balance it safely against the wall. Aunt Julia always declared that at this moment she was not actually watching him, but had turned her head towards the inner room, where she fancied she heard something moving. But, at any rate, both positively agreed that there came a sound of rushing feet, heavy and very swift, and the next instant the candle was out. But to Shorthouse himself had come more than this, and he has always thanked his fortunate stars that it came to him alone and not to his aunt too. For, as he rose from the stooping position of balancing the candle, and before it was actually extinguished, a face thrust itself forward so close to his own that he could almost have touched it with his lips. It was a face working with passion, a man's face, dark, with thick features and angry, savage eyes. It belonged to a common man, and it was evil in its ordinary normal expression, no doubt, but as he saw it, alive with intense, aggressive emotion, it was a malignant and terrible human countenance. There was no movement of the air, nothing but the sound of rushing feet, stockinged or muffled feet, the apparition of the face, and the almost simultaneous extinguishing of the candle. In spite of himself, Shorthouse uttered a little cry, nearly losing his balance as his aunt clung to him with her whole weight in one moment of real, uncontrollable terror. She made no sound, but simply seized him bodily. Fortunately, however, she had seen nothing, but had only heard the rushing feet, for her control returned almost at once, and he was able to disentangle himself and strike a match. The shadows ran away on all sides before the glare, and his aunt stooped down and groped for the cigar case with the precious candle. Then they discovered that the candle had not been blown out at all. It had been crushed out. The wick was pressed down into the wax, which was flattened as if by some smooth, heavy instrument. How his companion so quickly overcame her terror, Shorthouse never properly understood, but his admiration for her self-control increased tenfold, and at the same time served to feed his own dying flame, for which he was undeniably grateful. Equally inexplicable to him was the evidence of physical force they had just witnessed. He at once suppressed the memory of stories he had heard of physical mediums and their dangerous phenomena, for if these were true, and either his aunt or himself was unwittingly a physical medium, it meant that they were simply aiding to focus the forces of a haunted house already charged to the brim. It was like walking with unprotected lamps among uncovered stores of gunpowder. So, with as little reflection as possible, he simply relit the candle and went up to the next floor. The arm in his trembled, it is true, and his own tread was often uncertain, but they went on with thoroughness, and after a search revealing nothing, they climbed the last flight of stairs to the top floor of all. Here they found a perfect nest of small servants' rooms, with broken pieces of furniture, dirty cane-bottomed chairs, chests of drawers, cracked mirrors, and decrepit bedsteads. The rooms had low sloping ceilings already hung here and there with cobwebs, small windows, and badly plastered walls, a depressing and dismal region which they were glad to leave behind. It was on the stroke of midnight when they entered a small room on the third floor, close to the top of the stairs, and arranged to make themselves comfortable for the remainder of their adventure. It was absolutely bare and was said to be the room, then used as a clothes closet, into which the infuriated groom had chased his victim and finally caught her. Outside, across the narrow landing, began the stairs leading up to the floor above and the servants' quarters where they had just searched. In spite of the chilliness of the night, there was something in the air of this room that cried for an open window. But there was more than this. Shorthouse could only describe it by saying that he felt less master of himself here than in any other part of the house. There was something that acted directly on the nerves, tiring the resolution, enfeebling the will. He was conscious of this result before he had been in the room 5 minutes, and it was in the short time they stayed there that he suffered the wholesale depletion of his vital forces, which was, for himself, the chief horror of the whole experience. They put the candle on the floor of the cupboard, leaving the door a few inches ajar, so that there was no glare to confuse the eyes and no shadow to shift about on walls and ceiling. Then they spread the cloak on the floor and sat down to wait, with their backs against the wall. Shorthouse was within 2 feet of the door onto the landing. His position commanded a good view of the main staircase leading down into the darkness, and also of the beginning of the servants' stairs going to the floor above. The heavy stick lay beside him, within easy reach. The moon was now high above the house. Through the open window, they could see the comforting stars like friendly eyes watching in the sky. One by one, the clocks of the town struck midnight, and when the sounds died away, the deep silence of a windless night fell again over everything. Only the boom of the sea, far away and lugubrious, filled the air with hollow murmurs. Inside the house, the silence became awful. Awful, he thought, because any minute now it might be broken by sounds portending terror. The strain of waiting told more and more severely on the nerves. They talked in whispers when they talked at all, for their voices aloud sounded queer and unnatural. A chilliness, not altogether due to the night air, invaded the room and made them cold. The influences against them, whatever these might be, were slowly robbing them of self-confidence and the power of decisive action. Their forces were on the wane, and the possibility of real fear took on a new and terrible meaning. He began to tremble for the elderly woman by his side, whose pluck could hardly save her beyond a certain extent. He heard the blood singing in his veins. It sometimes seemed so loud that he fancied it prevented his hearing properly certain other sounds that were beginning very faintly to make themselves audible in the depths of the house. Every time he fastened his attention on these sounds, they instantly ceased. They certainly came no nearer. Yet he could not rid himself of the idea that movement was going on somewhere in the lower regions of the house. The drawing-room floor, where the doors had been so strangely closed, seemed too near. The sounds were further off than that. He thought of the great kitchen, with the scurrying black beetles, and of the dismal little scullery. But somehow or other, they did not seem to come from there either. Surely they were not outside the house. Then, suddenly, the truth flashed into his mind, and for the space of a minute he felt as if his blood had stopped flowing and turned to ice. The sounds were not downstairs at all. They were upstairs, somewhere among those horrid, gloomy little servants' rooms with their bits of broken furniture, low ceilings, and cramped windows. Upstairs where the victim had first been disturbed and stalked to her death. And the moment he discovered where the sounds were, he began to hear them more clearly. It was the sound of feet moving stealthily along the passage overhead, in and out among the rooms, and past the furniture. He turned quickly to steal a glance at the motionless figure seated beside him, to note whether she had shared his discovery. The faint candlelight coming through the crack in the cupboard door threw her strongly marked face into vivid relief against the white of the wall. But it was something else that made him catch his breath and stare again. An extraordinary something had come in her face and seemed to spread over her features like a mask. It smoothed out the deep lines and drew the skin everywhere a little tighter so that the wrinkles disappeared. It brought into the face, with the sole exception of the old eyes, an appearance of youth and almost a childhood. He stared in speechless amazement that was dangerously near to horror. It was his aunt's face indeed, but it was her face of 40 years ago, the vacant, innocent face of a girl. He had heard stories of that strange effect of terror which could wipe a human countenance clean of other emotions, obliterating all previous expressions. But he had never realized that it could be literally true or could mean anything so simply horrible as what he now saw. For the dreadful signature of overmastering fear was written plainly in that utter vacancy of the girlish face beside him. And when, feeling his intense gaze, she turned to look at him, he instinctively closed his eyes tightly to shut out the sight. Yet, when he turned a minute later, his feelings well in hand, he saw to his intense relief another expression. His aunt was smiling, and though the face was deathly white, the awful veil had lifted and the normal look was returning. Anything wrong? Was all he could think of to say at the moment. And the answer was eloquent, coming from such a woman. "I feel cold." And a little frightened, she whispered. He offered to close the window, but she seized hold of him and begged him not to leave her side, even for an instant. "It's upstairs, I know," she whispered with an odd half-laugh, "but I can't possibly go up." But Shorthouse thought otherwise, knowing that in action lay their best hope of self-control. He took the brandy flask and poured out a glass of neat spirit, stiff enough to help anybody over anything. She swallowed it with a little shiver. His only idea now was to get out of the house before her collapse became inevitable. But this could not safely be done by turning tail and running from the enemy. Inaction was no longer possible. Every minute he was growing less master of himself, and desperate, aggressive measures were imperative without further delay. Moreover, the action must be taken towards the enemy, not away from it. The climax, if necessary and unavoidable, would have to be faced boldly. He could do it now, but in 10 minutes he might not have the force left to act for himself, much less for both. Upstairs, the sounds were meanwhile becoming louder and closer, accompanied by occasional creaking of the boards. Someone was moving stealthily about, stumbling now and then awkwardly against the furniture, waiting a few moments to allow the tremendous dose of spirits to produce its effect, and knowing this would last but a short time under the circumstances, Shorthouse then quietly got on his feet, saying in a determined voice, "Now, Aunt Julia, we'll go upstairs and find out what all this noise is about. You must come too. It's what we agreed." He picked up his stick and went to the cupboard for the candle. A limp form rose shakily beside him, breathing hard, and he heard a voice say very faintly something about being ready to come. The woman's courage amazed him. It was so much greater than his own. And as they advanced, holding aloft the dripping candle, some subtle force exhaled from this trembling, white-faced old woman at his side that was the true source of his inspiration. It held something really great that shamed him and gave him the support, without which he would have proved far less equal to the occasion. They crossed the dark landing, avoiding with their eyes the deep black space over the banisters. Then they began to mount the narrow staircase to meet the sounds which, minute by minute, grew louder and nearer. About halfway up the stairs, Aunt Julia stumbled and Shorthouse turned to catch her by the arm. And just at that moment there came a terrific crash in the servants' corridor overhead. It was instantly followed by a shrill, agonized scream that was a cry of terror and a cry for help melted into one. Before they could move aside or go down a single step, someone came rushing along the passage overhead, blundering horribly, racing madly, at full speed, 3 steps at a time, down the very staircase where they stood. The steps were light and uncertain, but close behind them sounded the heavier tread of another person, and the staircase seemed to shake. Shorthouse and his companion just had time to flatten themselves against the wall when the jumble of flying steps was upon them, and two persons, with the slightest possible interval between them, dashed past at full speed. It was a perfect whirlwind of sound breaking in upon the midnight silence of the empty building. The two runners, pursuer and pursued, had passed clean through them where they stood, and already with a thud the boards below had received first one, then the other. Yet they had seen absolutely nothing, not a hand or arm or face or even a shred of flying clothing. There came a second's pause. Then the first one, the lighter of the two, obviously the pursued one, ran with uncertain footsteps into the little room which Shorthouse and his aunt had just left. The heavier one followed. There was a sound of scuffling, gasping, and smothered screaming, and then out onto the landing came the step of a single person treading weightily. A dead silence followed for the space of half a minute, and then was heard a rushing sound through the air. It was followed by a dull, crashing thud in the depths of the house below, on the stone floor of the hall. Utter silence reigned after. Nothing moved. The flame of the candle was steady. It had been steady the whole time, and the air had been undisturbed by any movement whatsoever. Palsied with terror, Aunt Julia, without waiting for her companion, began fumbling her way downstairs. She was crying gently to herself, and when Shorthouse put his arm round her and half carried her, he felt that she was trembling like a leaf. He went into the little room and picked up the cloak from the floor, and, arm in arm, walking very slowly, without speaking a word or looking once behind them, they marched down the 3 flights into the hall. In the hall they saw nothing, but the whole way down the stairs they were conscious that someone followed them. Step by step, when they went faster IT was left behind, and when they went more slowly IT caught them up. But never once did they look behind to see. And at each turning of the staircase, they lowered their eyes for fear of the following horror they might see upon the stairs above. With trembling hands, Shorthouse opened the front door, and they walked out into the moonlight and drew a deep breath of the cool night air blowing in from the sea. A haunted island. The following events occurred on a small island of isolated position in a large Canadian lake, to whose cool waters the inhabitants of Montreal and Toronto flee for rest and recreation in the hot months. It is only to be regretted that events of such peculiar interest to the genuine student of the psychical should be entirely uncorroborated. Such, unfortunately, however, is the case. Our own party of nearly 20 had returned to Montreal that very day, and I was left in solitary possession for a week or two longer in order to accomplish some important reading for the law which I had foolishly neglected during the summer. It was late in September, and the big trout and maskinonge were stirring themselves in the depths of the lake and beginning slowly to move up to the surface waters as the north winds and early frosts lowered their temperature. Already the maples were crimson and gold, and the wild laughter of the loons echoed in sheltered bays that never knew their strange cry in the summer. With a whole island to oneself, a 2-story cottage, a canoe, and only the chipmunks, and the farmer's weekly visit with eggs and bread to disturb one, the opportunities for hard reading might be very great. It all depends. The rest of the party had gone off with many warnings to beware of Indians, and not to stay late enough to be the victim of a frost that thinks nothing of 40 below zero. After they had gone, the loneliness of the situation made itself unpleasantly felt. There were no other islands within 6 or 7 miles, and though the mainland forests lay a couple of miles behind me, they stretched for a very great distance unbroken by any signs of human habitation. But, though the island was completely deserted and silent, the rocks and trees that had echoed human laughter and voices almost every hour of the day for 2 months could not fail to retain some memories of it all. And I was not surprised to fancy I heard a shout or a cry as I passed from rock to rock, and more than once to imagine that I heard my own name called aloud. In the cottage there were 6 tiny little bedrooms divided from one another by plain, unvarnished partitions of pine. A wooden bedstead, a mattress, and a chair stood in each room, but I only found 2 mirrors, and one of these was broken. The boards creaked a good deal as I moved about, and the signs of occupation were so recent that I could hardly believe I was alone. I half expected to find someone left behind, still trying to crowd into a box more than it would hold. The door of one room was stiff and refused for a moment to open, and it required very little persuasion to imagine someone was holding the handle on the inside, and that when it opened, I should meet a pair of human eyes. A thorough search of the floor led me to select as my own sleeping quarters a little room with a diminutive balcony over the veranda roof. The room was very small, but the bed was large and had the best mattress of them all. It was situated directly over the sitting room where I should live and do my reading, and the miniature window looked out to the rising sun. With the exception of a narrow path which led from the front door and veranda through the trees to the boat landing, the island was densely covered with maples, hemlocks, and cedars. The trees gathered in round the cottage so closely that the slightest wind made the branches scrape the roof and tap the wooden walls. A few moments after sunset, the darkness became impenetrable, and 10 yards beyond the glare of the lamps that shone through the sitting room windows, of which there were 4, you could not see an inch before your nose, nor move a step without running up against a tree. The rest of that day, I spent moving my belongings from my tent to the sitting room, taking stock of the contents of the larder, and chopping enough wood for the stove to last me for a week. After that, just before sunset, I went round the island a couple of times in my canoe for precaution's sake. I had never dreamed of doing this before, but when a man is alone, he does things that never occur to him when he is one of a large party. How lonely the island seemed when I landed again. The sun was down, and twilight is unknown in these northern regions. The darkness comes up at once. The canoe safely pulled up and turned over on her face. I groped my way up the little narrow pathway to the veranda. The 6 lamps were soon burning merrily in the front room, but in the kitchen where I dined, the shadows were so gloomy and the lamplight was so inadequate that the stars could be seen peeping through the cracks between the rafters. I turned in early that night. Though it was calm and there was no wind, the creaking of my bedstead and the musical gurgle of the water over the rocks below were not the only sounds that reached my ears. As I lay awake, the appalling emptiness of the house grew upon me. The corridors and vacant rooms seemed to echo innumerable footsteps, shufflings, the rustle of skirts, and a constant undertone of whispering. When sleep at length overtook me, the breathings and noises, however, passed gently to mingle with the voices of my dreams. A week passed by, and the reading progressed favorably. On the 10th day of my solitude, a strange thing happened. I awoke after a good night's sleep to find myself possessed with a marked repugnance for my room. The air seemed to stifle me. The more I tried to define the cause of this dislike, the more unreasonable it appeared. There was something about the room that made me afraid. Absurd as it seems, this feeling clung to me obstinately while dressing, and more than once I caught myself shivering and conscious of an inclination to get out of the room as quickly as possible. The more I tried to laugh it away, the more real it became, and when at last I was dressed and went out into the passage and downstairs into the kitchen, it was with feelings of relief, such as I might imagine would accompany one's escape from the presence of a dangerous, contagious disease. While cooking my breakfast, I carefully recalled every night spent in the room, in the hope that I might in some way connect the dislike I now felt with some disagreeable incident that had occurred in it. But the only thing I could recall was one stormy night when I suddenly awoke and heard the boards creaking so loudly in the corridor that I was convinced there were people in the house. So certain was I of this, that I had descended the stairs, gun in hand, only to find the doors and windows securely fastened and the mice and black beetles in sole possession of the floor. This was certainly not sufficient to account for the strength of my feelings. The morning hours I spent in steady reading, and when I broke off in the middle of the day for a swim and luncheon, I was very much surprised, if not a little alarmed, to find that my dislike for the room had, if anything, grown stronger. Going upstairs to get a book, I experienced the most marked aversion to entering the room, and while within I was conscious all the time of an uncomfortable feeling that was half uneasiness and half apprehension. The result of it was that, instead of reading, I spent the afternoon on the water paddling and fishing, and when I got home about sundown, brought with me half a dozen delicious black bass for the supper table and a larder. As sleep was an important matter to me at this time, I had decided that if my aversion to the room was so strongly marked on my return as it had been before, I would move my bed down into the sitting room and sleep there. This was, I argued, in no sense a concession to an absurd and fanciful fear, but simply a precaution to ensure a good night's sleep. A bad night involved the loss of the next day's reading, a loss I was not prepared to incur. I accordingly moved my bed downstairs into a corner of the sitting room facing the door, and was moreover uncommonly glad when the operation was completed and the door of the bedroom closed finally upon the shadows, the silence, and the strange fear that shared the room with them. The croaking stroke of the kitchen clock sounded the hour of 8 as I finished washing up my few dishes and closing the kitchen door behind me, passed into the front room. All the lamps were lit, and their reflectors, which I had polished up during the day, threw a blaze of light into the room. Outside the night was still and warm. Not a breath of air was stirring. The waves were silent, the trees motionless, and heavy clouds hung like an oppressive curtain over the heavens. The darkness seemed to have rolled up with unusual swiftness, and not the faintest glow of color remained to show where the sun had set. There was present in the atmosphere that ominous and overwhelming silence which so often precedes the most violent storms. I sat down to my books with my brain unusually clear, and in my heart the pleasant satisfaction of knowing that 5 black bass were lying in the ice house, and that tomorrow morning the old farmer would arrive with fresh bread and eggs. I was soon absorbed in my books. As the night wore on, the silence deepened. Even the chipmunks were still, and the boards of the floors and walls ceased creaking. I read on steadily till, from the gloomy shadows of the kitchen, came the hoarse sound of the clock striking 9. How loud the strokes sounded! They were like blows of a big hammer. I closed one book and opened another, feeling that I was just warming up to my work. This, however, did not last long. I presently found that I was reading the same paragraphs over twice, simple paragraphs that did not require such effort. Then I noticed that my mind began to wander to other things, and the effort to recall my thoughts became harder with each digression. Concentration was growing momentarily more difficult. Presently, I discovered that I had turned over 2 pages instead of 1, and had not noticed my mistake until I was well down the page. This was becoming serious. What was the disturbing influence? It could not be physical fatigue. On the contrary, my mind was unusually alert and in a more receptive condition than usual. I made a new and determined effort to read, and for a short time succeeded in giving my whole attention to my subject. But in a very few moments again, I found myself leaning back in my chair, staring vacantly into space. Something was evidently at work in my subconsciousness. There was something I had neglected to do. Perhaps the kitchen door and windows were not fastened. I accordingly went to see, and found that they were. The fire perhaps needed attention. I went in to see, and found that it was all right. I looked at the lamps, went upstairs into every bedroom in turn, and then went round the house, and even into the ice house. Nothing was wrong. Everything was in its place. Yet something was wrong. The conviction grew stronger and stronger within me. When I at length settled down to my books again and tried to read, I became aware for the first time that the room seemed growing cold. Yet the day had been oppressively warm, and evening had brought no relief. The 6 big lamps, moreover, gave out heat enough to warm the room pleasantly. But a chilliness that perhaps crept up from the lake made itself felt in the room, and caused me to get up to close the glass door opening on to the veranda. For a brief moment, I stood looking out at the shaft of light that fell from the windows and shone some little distance down the pathway, and out for a few feet into the lake. As I looked, I saw a canoe glide into the pathway of light, and immediately crossing it, pass out of sight again into the darkness. It was perhaps 100 feet from the shore, and it moved swiftly. I was surprised that a canoe should pass the island at that time of night, for all the summer visitors from the other side of the lake had gone home weeks before, and the island was a long way out of any line of water traffic. My reading from this moment did not make very good progress, for somehow the picture of that canoe, gliding so dimly and swiftly across the narrow track of light on the black waters, silhouetted itself against the background of my mind with singular vividness. It kept coming between my eyes and the printed page. The more I thought about it, the more surprised I became. It was of larger build than any I had seen during the past summer months, and was more like the old Indian war canoes with the high curving bows and stern and wide beam. The more I tried to read, the less success attended my efforts. And finally, I closed my books and went out on the veranda to walk up and down a bit and shake the chilliness out of my bones. The night was perfectly still and as dark as imaginable. I stumbled down the path to the little landing wharf, where the water made the very faintest of gurgling under the timbers. The sound of a big tree falling in the mainland forest, far across the lake, stirred echoes in the heavy air, like the first guns of a distant night attack. No other sound disturbed the stillness that reigned supreme. As I stood upon the wharf in the broad splash of light that followed me from the sitting room windows, I saw another canoe cross the pathway of uncertain light upon the water and disappear at once into the impenetrable gloom that lay beyond. This time I saw more distinctly than before. It was like the former canoe, a big birch bark with high-crested bows and stern and broad beam. It was paddled by two Indians, of whom the one in the stern, the steerer, appeared to be a very large man. I could see this very plainly, and though the second canoe was much nearer the island than the first, I judged that they were both on their way home to the government reservation, which was situated some 15 miles away upon the mainland. I was wondering in my mind what could possibly bring any Indians down to this part of the lake at such an hour of the night, when a third canoe, of precisely similar build and also occupied by two Indians, passed silently round the end of the wharf. This time the canoe was very much nearer shore, and it suddenly flashed into my mind that the three canoes were in reality one and the same, and that only one canoe was circling the island. This was by no means a pleasant reflection, because if it were the correct solution of the unusual appearance of the three canoes in this lonely part of the lake at so late an hour, the purpose of the two men could only reasonably be considered to be in some way connected with myself. I had never known of the Indians attempting any violence upon the settlers who shared the wild and hospitable country with them. At the same time, it was not beyond the region of possibility to suppose. But then I did not care even to think of such hideous possibilities, and my imagination immediately sought relief in all manner of other solutions to the problem, which indeed came readily enough to my mind, but did not succeed in recommending themselves to my reason. Meanwhile, by a sort of instinct, I stepped back out of the bright light in which I had hitherto been standing, and waited in the deep shadow of a rock to see if the canoe would again make its appearance. Here I could see, without being seen, and the precaution seemed a wise one. After less than 5 minutes the canoe, as I had anticipated, made its fourth appearance. This time it was not 20 yards from the wharf, and I saw that the Indians meant to land. I recognized the two men as those who had passed before, and the steerer was certainly an immense fellow. It was unquestionably the same canoe. There could be no longer any doubt that for some purpose of their own the men had been going round and round the island for some time, waiting for an opportunity to land. I strained my eyes to follow them in the darkness, but the night had completely swallowed them up, and not even the faintest swish of the paddles reached my ears as the Indians plied their long and powerful strokes. The canoe would be round again in a few moments, and this time it was possible that the men might land. It was well to be prepared. I knew nothing of their intentions, and 2 to 1, when the two are big Indians, late at night on a lonely island was not exactly my idea of pleasant intercourse. In a corner of the sitting room, leaning up against the back wall, stood my Marlin rifle, with 10 cartridges in the magazine and one lying snugly in the grease breech. There was just time to get up to the house and take up a position of defense in that corner. Without an instant's hesitation, I ran up to the veranda, carefully picking my way among the trees, so as to avoid being seen in the light. Entering the room, I shut the door leading to the veranda, and as quickly as possible turned out every one of the 6 lamps. To be in a room so brilliantly lighted, where my every movement could be observed from outside, while I could see nothing but impenetrable darkness at every window, was by all laws of warfare an unnecessary concession to the enemy. And this enemy, if enemy it was to be, was far too wily and dangerous to be granted any such advantages. I stood in the corner of the room with my back against the wall and my hand on the cold rifle barrel. The table, covered with my books, lay between me and the door, but for the first few minutes after the lights were out, the darkness was so intense that nothing could be discerned at all. Then, very gradually, the outline of the room became visible, and the framework of the windows began to shape itself dimly before my eyes. After a few minutes, the door, its upper half of glass, and the two windows that looked out upon the front veranda became specially distinct, and I was glad that this was so, because if the Indians came up to the house, I should be able to see their approach and gather something of their plans. Nor was I mistaken, for there presently came to my ears the peculiar hollow sound of a canoe landing and being carefully dragged up over the rocks. The paddles I distinctly heard being placed underneath, and the silence that ensued thereupon I rightly interpreted to mean that the Indians were stealthily approaching the house. While it would be absurd to claim that I was not alarmed, even frightened at the gravity of the situation and its possible outcome, I speak the whole truth when I say that I was not overwhelmingly afraid for myself. I was conscious that even at this stage of the night, I was passing into a psychical condition in which my sensations seemed no longer normal. Physical fear at no time entered into the nature of my feelings, and though I kept my hand upon my rifle the greater part of the night, I was all the time conscious that its assistance could be of little avail against the terrors that I had to face. More than once I seemed to feel most curiously that I was in no real sense a part of the proceedings, nor actually involved in them, but that I was playing the part of a spectator, moreover, on a psychic rather than on a material plane. Many of my sensations that night were too vague for definite description and analysis, but the main feeling that will stay with me to the end of my days is the awful horror of it all, and the miserable sensation that if the strain had lasted a little longer than was actually the case, my mind must inevitably have given way. Meanwhile, I stood still in my corner and waited patiently for what was to come. The house was as still as the grave, but the inarticulate voices of the night sang in my ears, and I seemed to hear the blood running in my veins and dancing in my pulses. If the Indians came to the back of the house, they would find the kitchen door and window securely fastened. They could not get in there without making considerable noise, which I was bound to hear. The only mode of getting in was by means of the door that faced me, and I kept my eyes glued on that door without taking them off for the smallest fraction of a second. My sight adapted itself every minute better to the darkness. I saw the table that nearly filled the room and left only a narrow passage on each side. I could also make out the straight backs of the wooden chairs pressed up against it, and could even distinguish my papers and inkstand lying on the white oilcloth covering. I thought of the gay faces that had gathered round that table during the summer, and I longed for the sunlight as I had never longed for it before. Less than 3 feet to my left the passageway led to the kitchen, and the stairs leading to the bedrooms above commenced in this passageway, but almost in the sitting room itself. Through the windows I could see the dim, motionless outlines of the trees. Not a leaf stirred, not a branch moved. A few moments of this awful silence, and then I was aware of a soft tread on the boards of the veranda, so stealthy that it seemed an impression directly on my brain rather than upon the nerves of hearing. Immediately afterwards, a black figure darkened the glass door, and I perceived that a face was pressed against the upper panes. A shiver ran down my back, and my hair was conscious of a tendency to rise and stand at right angles to my head. It was the figure of an Indian, broad-shouldered and immense. Indeed, the largest figure of a man I have ever seen outside of a circus hall. By some power of light that seemed to generate itself in the brain, I saw the strong, dark face with the aquiline nose and high cheekbones flattened against the glass. The direction of the gaze I could not determine, but faint gleams of light as the big eyes rolled round and showed their whites told me plainly that no corner of the room escaped their searching. For what seemed fully 5 minutes the dark figure stood there, with the huge shoulders bent forward so as to bring the head down to the level of the glass, while behind him, though not nearly so large, the shadowy form of the other Indian swayed to and fro like a bent tree. While I waited in an agony of suspense and agitation for their next movement, little currents of icy sensation ran up and down my spine, and my heart seemed alternately to stop beating and then start off again with terrifying rapidity. They must have heard its thumping and the singing of the blood in my head. Moreover, I was conscious, as I felt a cold stream of perspiration trickle down my face, of a desire to scream, to shout, to bang the walls like a child, to make a noise, or do anything that would relieve the suspense and bring things to a speedy climax. It was probably this inclination that led me to another discovery, for when I tried to bring my rifle from behind my back to raise it and have it pointed at the door ready to fire, I found that I was powerless to move. The muscles, paralyzed by this strange fear, refused to obey the will. Here indeed was a terrifying complication. There was a faint sound of rattling at the brass knob, and the door was pushed open a couple of inches. A pause of a few seconds, and it was pushed open still further. Without a sound of footsteps that was appreciable to my ears, the two figures glided into the room, and the man behind gently closed the door after him. They were alone with me between the four walls. Could they see me standing there, so still and straight in my corner? Had they, perhaps, already seen me? My blood surged and sang like the roll of drums in an orchestra, and though I did my best to suppress my breathing, it sounded like the rushing of wind through a pneumatic tube. My suspense as to the next move was soon at an end, only, however, to give place to a new and keener alarm. The men had hitherto exchanged no words and no signs, but there were general indications of a movement across the room, and whichever way they went they would have to pass round the table. If they came my way, they would have to pass within 6 inches of my person. While I was considering this very disagreeable possibility, I perceived that the smaller Indian, smaller by comparison, suddenly raised his arm and pointed to the ceiling. The other fellow raised his head and followed the direction of his companion's arm. I began to understand at last. They were going upstairs, and the room directly overhead to which they pointed had been until this night my bedroom. It was the room in which I had experienced that very morning so strange a sensation of fear, and but for which I should then have been lying asleep in the narrow bed against the window. The Indians then began to move silently around the room. They were going upstairs, and they were coming round my side of the table. So stealthy were their movements that, but for the abnormally sensitive state of the nerves, I should never have heard them, as it was their cat-like tread was distinctly audible. Like two monstrous black cats, they came round the table toward me, and for the first time I perceived that the smaller of the two dragged something along the floor behind him. As it trailed along over the floor with a soft, sweeping sound, I somehow got the impression that it was a large dead thing with outstretched wings, or a large spreading cedar branch. Whatever it was, I was unable to see it even in outline, and I was too terrified, even had I possessed the power over my muscles, to move my neck forward in the effort to determine its nature. Nearer and nearer they came. The leader rested a giant hand upon the table as he moved. My lips were glued together, and the air seemed to burn in my nostrils. I tried to close my eyes so that I might not see as they passed me, but my eyelids had stiffened and refused to obey. Would they never get by me? Sensation seemed also to have left my legs, and it was as if I were standing on mere supports of wood or stone. Worse still, I was conscious that I was losing the power of balance, the power to stand upright, or even to lean backwards against the wall. Some force was drawing me forward, and a dizzy terror seized me that I should lose my balance and topple forward against the Indians just as they were in the act of passing me. Even moments drawn out into hours must come to an end some time, and almost before I knew it the figures had passed me and had their feet upon the lower step of the stairs leading to the upper bedrooms. There could not have been 6 inches between us, and yet I was conscious only of a current of cold air that followed them. They had not touched me, and I was convinced that they had not seen me. Even the trailing thing on the floor behind them had not touched my feet, as I had dreaded it would, and on such an occasion as this, I was grateful even for the smallest mercies. The absence of the Indians from my immediate neighborhood brought little sense of relief. I stood shivering and shuddering in my corner, and beyond being able to breathe more freely, I felt no whit less uncomfortable. Also, I was aware that a certain light, which, without apparent source or rays, had enabled me to follow their every gesture and movement, had gone out of the room with their departure. An unnatural darkness now filled the room and pervaded its every corner so that I could barely make out the positions of the windows and the glass doors. As I said before, my condition was evidently an abnormal one. The capacity for feeling surprise seemed, as in dreams, to be wholly absent. My senses recorded with unusual accuracy every smallest occurrence, but I was able to draw only the simplest deductions. The Indians soon reached the top of the stairs, and there they halted for a moment. I had not the faintest clue as to their next movement. They appeared to hesitate. They were listening attentively. Then I heard one of them, who by the weight of his soft tread must have been the giant, cross the narrow corridor and enter the room directly overhead, my own little bedroom. But for the insistence of that unaccountable dread I had experienced there in the morning, I should at that very moment have been lying in the bed with the big Indian in the room, standing beside me. For the space of 100 seconds there was silence, such as might have existed before the birth of sound. It was followed by a long, quivering shriek of terror, which rang out into the night and ended in a short gulp before it had run its full course. At the same moment, the other Indian left his place at the head of the stairs and joined his companion in the bedroom. I heard the thing trailing behind him along the floor. A thud followed, as of something heavy falling, and then all became as still and silent as before. It was at this point that the atmosphere, surcharged all day with the electricity of a fierce storm, found relief in a dancing flash of brilliant lightning simultaneously with a crash of loudest thunder. For 5 seconds, every article in the room was visible to me with amazing distinctness, and through the windows I saw the tree trunks standing in solemn rows. The thunder pealed and echoed across the lake and among the distant islands, and the floodgates of heaven then opened and let out their rain in streaming torrents. The drops fell with a swift, rushing sound upon the still waters of the lake, which leaped up to meet them and pattered with the rattle of shot on the leaves of the maples and the roof of the cottage. A moment later, and another flash, even more brilliant and of longer duration than the first, lit up the sky from zenith to horizon and bathed the room momentarily in dazzling whiteness. I could see the rain glistening on the leaves and branches outside. The wind rose suddenly, and in less than a minute the storm that had been gathering all day burst forth in its full fury. Above all the noisy voices of the elements, the slightest sounds in the room overhead made themselves heard, and in the few seconds of deep silence that followed the shriek of terror and pain, I was aware that the movements had commenced again. The men were leaving the room and approaching the top of the stairs. A short pause, and they began to descend. Behind them, tumbling from step to step, I could hear that trailing thing being dragged along. It had become ponderous. I awaited their approach with a degree of calmness, almost of apathy, which was only explicable on the ground that after a certain point nature applies her own anesthetic, and a merciful condition of numbness supervenes. On they came, step by step, nearer and nearer, with the shuffling sound of the burden behind growing louder as they approached. They were already halfway down the stairs when I was galvanized afresh into a condition of terror by the consideration of a new and horrible possibility. It was the reflection that if another vivid flash of lightning were to come when the shadowy procession was in the room, perhaps when it was actually passing in front of me, I should see everything in detail, and worse, be seen myself. I could only hold my breath and wait while the minutes lengthened into hours, and the procession made its slow progress round the room. The Indians had reached the foot of the staircase. The form of the huge leader loomed in the doorway of the passage, and the burden with an ominous thud had dropped from the last step to the floor. There was a moment's pause while I saw the Indian turn and stoop to assist his companion. Then the procession moved forward again, entered the room close on my left, and began to move slowly round my side of the table. The leader was already beyond me, and his companion, dragging on the floor behind him the burden, whose confused outline I could dimly make out, was exactly in front of me when the cavalcade came to a dead halt. At the same moment, with the strange suddenness of thunderstorms, the splash of the rain ceased altogether, and the wind died away into utter silence. For the space of 5 seconds my heart seemed to stop beating, and then the worst came. A double flash of lightning lit up the room and its contents with merciless vividness. The huge Indian leader stood a few feet past me on my right. One leg was stretched forward in the act of taking a step. His immense shoulders were turned toward his companion, and in all their magnificent fierceness, I saw the outline of his features. His gaze was directed upon the burden his companion was dragging along the floor. But his profile, with the big, aquiline nose, high cheekbone, straight black hair, and bold chin, burned itself in that brief instant into my brain, never again to fade. Dwarfish compared with this gigantic figure, appeared the proportions of the other Indian, who, within 12 inches of my face, was stooping over the thing he was dragging in a position that lent to his person the additional horror of deformity. And the burden, lying upon a sweeping cedar branch which he held and dragged by a long stem, was the body of a white man. The scalp had been neatly lifted, and blood lay in a broad smear upon the cheeks and forehead. Then, for the first time that night, the terror that had paralyzed my muscles and my will lifted its unholy spell from my soul. With a loud cry, I stretched out my arms to seize the big Indian by the throat and, grasping only air, tumbled forward unconscious upon the ground. I had recognized the body, and the face was my own. It was bright daylight when a man's voice recalled me to consciousness. I was lying where I had fallen, and the farmer was standing in the room with the loaves of bread in his hands. The horror of the night was still in my heart, and as the bluff settler helped me to my feet and picked up the rifle which had fallen with me, with many questions and expressions of condolence, I imagine my brief replies were neither self-explanatory nor even intelligible. That day, after a thorough and fruitless search of the house, I left the island and went over to spend my last 10 days with the farmer. And when the time came for me to leave, the necessary reading had been accomplished, and my nerves had completely recovered their balance. On the day of my departure, the farmer started early in his big boat with my belongings to row to the point, 12 miles distant, where a little steamer ran twice a week for the accommodation of hunters. Late in the afternoon, I went off in another direction in my canoe, wishing to see the island once again, where I had been the victim of so strange an experience. In due course, I arrived there and made a tour of the island. I also made a search of the little house, and it was not without a curious sensation in my heart that I entered the little upstairs bedroom. There seemed nothing unusual. Just after I re-embarked, I saw a canoe gliding ahead of me around the curve of the island. A canoe was an unusual sight at this time of the year, and this one seemed to have sprung from nowhere. Altering my course a little, I watched it disappear around the next projecting point of rock. It had high curving bows, and there were 2 Indians in it. I lingered with some excitement to see if it would appear again round the other side of the island, and in less than 5 minutes it came into view. There were less than 200 yards between us, and the Indians, sitting on their haunches, were paddling swiftly in my direction. I never paddled faster in my life than I did in those next few minutes. When I turned to look again, the Indians had altered their course and were again circling the island. The sun was sinking behind the forest on the mainland, and the crimson-colored clouds of sunset were reflected in the waters of the lake when I looked round for the last time and saw the big bark canoe and its 2 dusky occupants still going round the island. Then the shadows deepened rapidly, the lake grew black, and the night wind blew its first breath in my face as I turned a corner, and a projecting bluff of rock hid from my view both island and canoe. A case of eavesdropping. Jim Shorthouse was the sort of fellow who always made a mess of things. Everything with which his hands or mind came into contact issued from such contact in an unqualified and irremediable state of mess. His college days were a mess. He was twice rusticated. His school days were a mess. He went to half a dozen, each passing him on to the next with a worse character and in a more developed state of mess. His early boyhood was the sort of mess that copybooks and dictionaries spell with a big M, and his babyhood, ugh, was the embodiment of howling, yowling, screaming mess. At the age of 40, however, there came a change in his troubled life when he met a girl with $500,000 in her own right who consented to marry him and who very soon succeeded in reducing his most messy existence into a state of comparative order and system. Certain incidents, important and otherwise, of Jim's life would never have come to be told here, but for the fact that in getting into his messes and out of them again, he succeeded in drawing himself into the atmosphere of peculiar circumstances and strange happenings. He attracted to his path the curious adventures of life as unfailingly as meat attracts flies and jam wasps. It is to the meat and jam of his life, so to speak, that he owes his experiences. His afterlife was all pudding, which attracts nothing but greedy children. With marriage, the interest of his life ceased for all but one person, and his path became regular as the sun's instead of erratic as a comet's. The first experience in order of time that he related to me shows that somewhere latent behind his disarranged nervous system there lay psychic perceptions of an uncommon order. About the age of 22, I think after his second rustication, his father's purse and patience had equally given out, and Jim found himself stranded high and dry in a large American city. High and dry, and the only clothes that had no holes in them safely in the keeping of his uncle's wardrobe. Careful reflection on a bench in one of the city parks led him to the conclusion that the only thing to do was to persuade the city editor of one of the daily journals that he possessed an observant mind and a ready pen, and that he could do good work for your paper, sir, as a reporter. This then he did, standing at a most unnatural angle between the editor and the window to conceal the whereabouts of the holes. "Guess we'll have to give you a week's trial," said the editor, who, ever on the lookout for good chance material, took on shoals of men in that way and retained on the average one man per shoal. Anyhow, it gave Jim Shorthouse the wherewithal to sew up the holes and relieve his uncle's wardrobe of its burden. Then he went to find living quarters, and in this proceeding his unique characteristics already referred to, what theosophists would call his karma, began unmistakably to assert themselves, for it was in the house he eventually selected that this sad tale took place. There are no diggings in American cities. The alternatives for small incomes are grim enough. Rooms in a boarding house where meals are served, or in a room house where no meals are served, not even breakfast. Rich people live in palaces, of course, but Jim had nothing to do with such-like. His horizon was bounded by boarding houses and room houses, and, owing to the necessary irregularity of his meals and hours, he took the latter. It was a large, gaunt-looking place in a side street, with dirty windows and a creaking iron gate, but the rooms were large, and the one he selected and paid for in advance was on the top floor. The landlady looked gaunt and dusty as the house, and quite as old. Her eyes were green and faded, and her features large. "Vol," she twanged, with her electrifying western drawl, "that's the room, if you like it, and that's the price I said. Now, if you want it, why, just say so, and if you don't, why, it don't hurt me any." Jim wanted to shake her, but he feared the clouds of long-accumulated dust in her clothes, and as the price and size of the room suited him, he decided to take it. "Anyone else on this floor?" he asked. She looked at him queerly out of her faded eyes before she answered. "None of my guests ever put such questions to me before," she said, "but I guess you're different." "Why? There's no one at all but an old gent that stayed here every bit of 5 years. He's over thar," pointing to the end of the passage. "Ah, I see," said Shorthouse feebly. "So, I'm alone up here?" "Reckon you are. Pretty near," she twanged out, ending the conversation abruptly by turning her back on her new guest and going slowly and deliberately downstairs. The newspaper work kept Shorthouse out most of the night. 3 times a week, he got home at 1 a.m., and 3 times at 3 a.m. The room proved comfortable enough, and he paid for a second week. His unusual hours had so far prevented his meeting any inmates of the house, and not a sound had been heard from the old gent who shared the floor with him. It seemed a very quiet house. One night, about the middle of the second week, he came home tired after a long day's work. The lamp that usually stood all night in the hall had burned itself out, and he had to stumble upstairs in the dark. He made considerable noise in doing so, but nobody seemed to be disturbed. The whole house was utterly quiet, and probably everybody was asleep. There were no lights under any of the doors. All was in darkness. It was after 2 o'clock. After reading some English letters that had come during the day, and dipping for a few minutes into a book, he became drowsy and got ready for bed. Just as he was about to get in between the sheets, he stopped for a moment and listened. There rose in the night, as he did so, the sound of steps somewhere in the house below. Listening attentively, he heard that it was somebody coming upstairs, a heavy tread, and the owner taking no pains to step quietly. On it came up the stairs, tramp, 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 evidently the tread of a big man, and one in something of a hurry. At once thoughts connected somehow with fire and police flashed through Jim's brain, but there were no sounds of voices with the steps, and he reflected in the same moment that it could only be the old gentleman keeping late hours and tumbling upstairs in the darkness. He was in the act of turning out the gas and stepping into bed, when the house resumed its former stillness by the footsteps suddenly coming to a dead stop immediately outside his own room. With his hand on the gas, Shorthouse paused a moment before turning it out to see if the steps would go on again, when he was startled by a loud knocking on his door. Instantly, in obedience to a curious and unexplained instinct, he turned out the light, leaving himself and the room in total darkness. He had scarcely taken a step across the room to open the door, when a voice from the other side of the wall, so close it almost sounded in his ear, exclaimed in German, "Is that you, father? Come in." The speaker was a man in the next room, and the knocking, after all, had not been on his own door, but on that of the adjoining chamber, which he had supposed to be vacant. Almost before the man in the passage had time to answer in German, "Let me in at once," Jim heard someone cross the floor and unlock the door. Then it was slammed to with a bang, and there was audible the sound of footsteps about the room and of chairs being drawn up to a table and knocking against furniture on the way. The men seemed wholly regardless of their neighbors' comfort, for they made noise enough to waken the dead. "Serves me right for taking a room in such a cheap hole," reflected Jim in the darkness. "I wonder whom she's let the room to." The 2 rooms, the landlady had told him, were originally one. She had put up a thin partition, just a row of boards, to increase her income. The doors were adjacent, and only separated by the massive upright beam between them. When one was opened or shut, the other rattled. With utter indifference to the comfort of the other sleepers in the house, the 2 Germans had meanwhile commenced to talk both at once and at the top of their voices. They talked emphatically, even angrily. The words "father" and "Otto" were freely used. Shorthouse understood German, but as he stood listening for the first minute or two, an eavesdropper in spite of himself, it was difficult to make head or tail of the talk, for neither would give way to the other, and the jumble of guttural sounds and unfinished sentences was wholly unintelligible. Then, very suddenly, both voices dropped together, and after a moment's pause, the deep tones of one of them, who seemed to be the father, said, with the utmost distinctness, "You mean, Otto, that you refused to get it?" There was a sound of someone shuffling in the chair before the answer came. "I mean that I don't know how to get it. It is so much, father. It is too much. A part of it." "A part of it," cried the other, with an angry oath. "A part of it, when ruin and disgrace are already in the house, is worse than useless. If you can get half, you can get all. You wretched fool. Half measures only damn all concerned. You told me last time," began the other firmly, but was not allowed to finish. A succession of horrible oaths drowned his sentence, and the father went on, in a voice vibrating with anger. "You know she will give you anything. You have only been married a few months. If you ask and give a plausible reason, you can get all we want and more. You can ask it temporarily. All will be paid back. It will re-establish the firm, and she will never know what was done with it. With that amount, Otto, you know I can recoup all these terrible losses, and in less than a year, all will be repaid. But without it, you must get it, Otto. Hear me, you must. Am I to be arrested for the misuse of trust moneys? Is our honored name to be cursed and spat on?" The old man choked and stammered in his anger and desperation. Shorthouse stood shivering in the darkness and listening in spite of himself. The conversation had carried him along with it, and he had been for some reason afraid to let his neighborhood be known. But at this point, he realized that he had listened too long and that he must inform the two men that they could be overheard to every single syllable. So he coughed loudly and at the same time rattled the handle of his door. It seemed to have no effect, for the voices continued just as loudly as before, the son protesting and the father growing more and more angry. He coughed again persistently, and also contrived purposely in the darkness to tumble against the partition, feeling the thin boards yield easily under his weight, and making a considerable noise in so doing. But the voices went on unconcernedly and louder than ever. Could it be possible they had not heard? By this time, Jim was more concerned about his own sleep than the morality of overhearing the private scandals of his neighbors, and he went out into the passage and knocked smartly at their door. Instantly, as if by magic, the sounds ceased. Everything dropped into utter silence. There was no light under the door, and not a whisper could be heard within. He knocked again, but received no answer. "Gentlemen," he began at length, with his lips close to the keyhole, and in German, "please do not talk so loud. I can overhear all you say in the next room. Besides, it is very late, and I wish to sleep." He paused and listened, but no answer was forthcoming. He turned the handle and found the door was locked. Not a sound broke the stillness of the night, except the faint swish of the wind over the skylight and the creaking of a board here and there in the house below. The cold air of a very early morning crept down the passage and made him shiver. The silence of the house began to impress him disagreeably. He looked behind him and about him, hoping, and yet fearing, that something would break the stillness. The voices still seemed to ring on in his ears, but that sudden silence, when he knocked at the door, affected him far more unpleasantly than the voices, and put strange thoughts in his brain, thoughts he did not like or approve. Moving stealthily from the door, he peered over the banisters into the space below. It was like a deep vault that might conceal in its shadows anything that was not good. It was not difficult to fancy he saw an indistinct moving to and fro below him. Was it a figure sitting on the stairs, peering up obliquely at him out of hideous eyes? Was it a sound of whispering and shuffling down there in the dark halls and forsaken landings? Was it something more than the inarticulate murmur of the night? The wind made an effort overhead, singing over the skylight, and the door behind him rattled and made him start. He turned to go back to his room, and the draft closed the door slowly in his face as if there were someone pressing against it from the other side. When he pushed it open and went in, 100 shadowy forms seemed to dart swiftly and silently back to their corners and hiding places. But in the adjoining room the sounds had entirely ceased, and Shorthouse soon crept into bed and left the house with its inmates, waking or sleeping to take care of themselves, while he entered the region of dreams and silence. Next day, strong in the common sense that the sunlight brings, he determined to lodge a complaint against the noisy occupants of the next room and make the landlady request them to modify their voices at such late hours of the night and morning. But it so happened that she was not to be seen that day, and when he returned from the office at midnight, it was, of course, too late. Looking under the door as he came up to bed, he noticed that there was no light, and concluded that the Germans were not in. So much the better. He went to sleep about 1 o'clock, fully decided that if they came up later and woke him with their horrible noises, he would not rest till he had roused the landlady and made her reprove them with that authoritative twang, in which every word was like the lash of a metallic whip. However, there proved to be no need for such drastic measures, for Shorthouse slumbered peacefully all night, and his dreams, chiefly of the fields of grain and flocks of sheep on the faraway farms of his father's estate, were permitted to run their fanciful course unbroken. 2 nights later, however, when he came home tired out after a difficult day and wet and blown about by one of the wickedest storms he had ever seen, his dreams, always of the fields and sheep, were not destined to be so undisturbed. He had already dozed off in that delicious glow that follows the removal of wet clothes and the immediate snuggling under warm blankets, when his consciousness, hovering on the borderland between sleep and waking, was vaguely troubled by a sound that rose indistinctly from the depths of the house, and between the gusts of wind and rain, reached his ears with an accompanying sense of uneasiness and discomfort. It rose on the night air with some pretense of regularity, dying away again in the roar of the wind to reassert itself distantly in the deep, brief hushes of the storm. For a few minutes, Jim's dreams were colored only, tinged, as it were, by this impression of fear approaching from somewhere insensibly upon him. His consciousness, at first, refused to be drawn back from that enchanted region where it had wandered, and he did not immediately awaken. But the nature of his dreams changed unpleasantly. He saw the sheep suddenly run huddled together, as though frightened by the neighborhood of an enemy, while the fields of waving corn became agitated as though some monster were moving uncouthly among the crowded stalks. The sky grew dark, and in his dream an awful sound came somewhere from the clouds. It was in reality the sound downstairs growing more distinct. Shorthouse shifted uneasily across the bed with something like a groan of distress. The next minute he awoke and found himself sitting straight up in bed, listening. Was it a nightmare? Had he been dreaming evil dreams, that his flesh crawled and the hair stirred on his head? The room was dark and silent, but outside the wind howled dismally and drove the rain with repeated assaults against the rattling windows. How nice it would be, the thought flashed through his mind, if all winds, like the west wind, went down with the sun. They made such fiendish noises at night, like the crying of angry voices. In the daytime, they had such a different sound. If only, hark! It was no dream after all, for the sound was momentarily growing louder, and its cause was coming up the stairs. He found himself speculating feebly what this cause might be, but the sound was still too indistinct to enable him to arrive at any definite conclusion. The voice of a church clock striking 2 made itself heard above the wind. It was just about the hour when the Germans had commenced their performance 3 nights before. Shorthouse made up his mind that if they began it again, he would not put up with it for very long. Yet he was already horribly conscious of the difficulty he would have of getting out of bed. The clothes were so warm and comforting against his back. The sound, still steadily coming nearer, had by this time become differentiated from the confused clamor of the elements, and had resolved itself into the footsteps of 1 or more persons. The Germans, hang him, thought Jim. But what on earth is the matter with me? I never felt so queer in all my life. He was trembling all over and felt as cold as though he were in a freezing atmosphere. His nerves were steady enough, and he felt no diminution of physical courage, but he was conscious of a curious sense of malaise and trepidation, such as even the most vigorous men have been known to experience when in the first grip of some horrible and deadly disease. As the footsteps approached, this feeling of weakness increased. He felt a strange lassitude creeping over him, a sort of exhaustion, accompanied by a growing numbness in the extremities and a sensation of dreaminess in the head, as if perhaps the consciousness were leaving its accustomed seat in the brain and preparing to act on another plane. Yet, strange to say, as the vitality was slowly withdrawn from his body, his senses seemed to grow more acute. Meanwhile, the steps were already on the landing at the top of the stairs, and Shorthouse, still sitting upright in bed, heard a heavy body brush past his door and along the wall outside. Almost immediately afterwards, the loud knocking of someone's knuckles on the door of the adjoining room. Instantly, though so far not a sound had proceeded from within, he heard, through the thin partition, a chair pushed back and a man quickly crossed the floor and opened the door. "Ah, it's you," he heard in the son's voice. Had the fellow, then, been sitting silently in there all this time, waiting for his father's arrival? To Shorthouse, it came not as a pleasant reflection by any means. There was no answer to this dubious greeting, but the door was closed quickly, and then there was a sound as if a bag or parcel had been thrown on a wooden table and had slid some distance across it before stopping. "What's that?" asked the son, with anxiety in his tone. "You may know before I go," returned the other gruffly. Indeed, his voice was more than gruff. It betrayed ill-suppressed passion. Shorthouse was conscious of a strong desire to stop the conversation before it proceeded any further, but somehow or other his will was not equal to the task, and he could not get out of bed. The conversation went on, every tone and inflection distinctly audible above the noise of the storm. In a low voice, the father continued. Jim missed some of the words at the beginning of the sentence. It ended with, "But now they've all left, and I've managed to get up to you. You know what I've come for?" There was distinct menace in his tone. "Yes," returned the other. "I have been waiting." "And the money?" asked the father impatiently. No answer. "You've had 3 days to get it in, and I've contrived to stave off the worst so far, but tomorrow is the end." No answer. "Speak, Otto. What have you got for me? Speak, my son. For God's sake, tell me." There was a moment's silence, during which the old man's vibrating accents seemed to echo through the rooms. Then came in a low voice the answer. "I have nothing." "Otto!" cried the other with passion. "Nothing. I can get nothing," came almost in a whisper. "You lie," cried the other in a half-stifled voice. "I swear you lie. Give me the money." A chair was heard scraping along the floor. Evidently the men had been sitting over the table, and one of them had risen. Shorthouse heard the bag or parcel drawn across the table, and then a step as if one of the men was crossing to the door. "Father, what's in that?" "I must know," said Otto, with the first signs of determination in his voice. There must have been an effort on the son's part to gain possession of the parcel in question, and on the father's to retain it, for between them it fell to the ground. A curious rattle followed its contact with the floor. Instantly there were sounds of a scuffle. The men were struggling for the possession of the box. The elder man with oaths and blasphemous imprecations, the other with short gasps that betokened the strength of his efforts. It was of short duration, and the younger man had evidently won, for a minute later was heard his angry exclamation. "I knew it. Her jewels! You scoundrel! You shall never have them. It is a crime." The elder man uttered a short, guttural laugh, which froze Jim's blood and made his skin creep. No word was spoken, and for the space of 10 seconds there was a living silence. Then the air trembled with the sound of a thud, followed immediately by a groan and the crash of a heavy body falling over onto the table. A second later, there was a lurching from the table onto the floor and against the partition that separated the rooms. The bed quivered an instant at the shock, but the unholy spell was lifted from his soul, and Jim Shorthouse sprang out of bed and across the floor in a single bound. He knew that ghastly murder had been done, the murder by a father of his son. With shaking fingers but a determined heart, he lit the gas. And the first thing in which his eyes corroborated the evidence of his ears was the horrifying detail that the lower portion of the partition bulged unnaturally into his own room. The glaring paper with which it was covered had cracked under the tension, and the boards beneath it bent inwards towards him. What hideous load was behind them? He shuddered to think. All this he saw in less than a second. Since the final lurch against the wall, not a sound had proceeded from the room, not even a groan or a footstep. All was still but the howl of the wind, which to his ears had in it a note of triumphant horror. Shorthouse was in the act of leaving the room to rouse the house and send for the police. In fact, his hand was already on the doorknob, when something in the room arrested his attention. Out of the corner of his eyes, he thought he caught sight of something moving. He was sure of it, and turning his eyes in the direction, he found he was not mistaken. Something was creeping slowly towards him along the floor. It was something dark and serpentine in shape, and it came from the place where the partition bulged. He stooped down to examine it with feelings of intense horror and repugnance, and he discovered that it was moving toward him from the other side of the wall. His eyes were fascinated, and for the moment he was unable to move. Silently, slowly, from side to side like a thick worm, it crawled forward into the room beneath his frightened eyes, until at length he could stand it no longer and stretched out his arm to touch it. But at the instant of contact, he withdrew his hand with a suppressed scream. It was sluggish, and it was warm, and he saw that his fingers were stained with living crimson. A second more, and Shorthouse was out in the passage with his hand on the door of the next room. It was locked. He plunged forward with all his weight against it, and, the lock giving way, he fell headlong into a room that was pitch dark and very cold. In a moment he was on his feet again and trying to penetrate the blackness. Not a sound, not a movement, not even the sense of a presence. It was empty, miserably empty, Across the room, he could trace the outline of a window with rain streaming down the outside and the blurred lights of the city beyond. But the room was empty, appallingly empty, and so still. He stood there, cold as ice, staring, shivering, listening. Suddenly, there was a step behind him, and a light flashed into the room. And when he turned quickly with his arm up as if to ward off a terrific blow, he found himself face to face with the landlady. Instantly, the reaction began to set in. It was nearly 3 o'clock in the morning, and he was standing there with bare feet and striped pajamas in a small room, which in the merciful light he perceived to be absolutely empty, carpetless, and without a stick of furniture or even a window blind. There he stood staring at the disagreeable landlady. And there she stood too, staring and silent, in a black wrapper, her head almost bald, her face white as chalk, shading a sputtering candle with one bony hand and peering over it at him with her blinking green eyes. She looked positively hideous. "Vol," she drawled at length, "I heard you're right enough. Guess you couldn't sleep, or just prowling around a bit. Is that it?" The empty room, the absence of all traces of the recent tragedy, the silence, the hour, his striped pajamas and bare feet, everything together combined to deprive him momentarily of speech. He stared at her blankly without a word. "Vol," clanked the awful voice. "My dear woman," he burst out finally, "there's been something awful. So far his desperation took him, but no farther." He positively stuck at the substantive. "Oh, there hasn't been nothing," she said slowly, still peering at him. "I reckon you've only seen and heard what the others did. I never can keep folks on this floor long. Most of 'em catch on sooner or later. That is, the ones that's kind of quick and sensitive. Only you being an Englishman, I thought you wouldn't mind. Nothing really happens. It's only thinking like." Shorthouse was beside himself. He felt ready to pick her up and drop her over the banisters, candle and all. "Look there," he said, pointing at her within an inch of her blinking eyes with the fingers that had touched the oozing blood. "Look there, my good woman. Is that only thinking?" She stared a minute, as if not knowing what he meant. "I guess so," she said at length. He followed her eyes, and to his amazement saw that his fingers were as white as usual and quite free from the awful stain that had been there 10 minutes before. There was no sign of blood. No amount of staring could bring it back. Had he gone out his mind? Had his eyes and ears played such tricks with him? Had his senses become false and perverted? He dashed past the landlady, out into the passage, and gained his own room in a couple of strides. Phew! The partition no longer bulged. The paper was not torn. There was no creeping, crawling thing on the faded old carpet. "It's all over now," drawled the metallic voice behind him. "I'm going to bed again." He turned and saw the landlady slowly going downstairs again, still shading the candle with her hand and peering up at him from time to time as she moved. A black, ugly, unwholesome object, he thought, as she disappeared into the darkness below, and the last flicker of her candle threw a queer-shaped shadow along the wall and over the ceiling. Without hesitating a moment, Shorthouse threw himself into his clothes and went out of the house. He preferred the storm to the horrors of that top floor, and he walked the streets till daylight. In the evening, he told the landlady he would leave next day, in spite of her assurances that nothing more would happen. "It never comes back," she said. "That is, not after he's killed." Shorthouse gasped. "You gave me a lot for my money," he growled. "Vol, it aren't my show," she drawled. "I'm no spirit medium. You take chances. Some'll sleep right along and never hear nothing. Others, like yourself, are different and get the whole thing." "Who's the old gentleman? Does he hear it?" asked Jim. "There's no old gentleman at all," she answered coolly. "I just told you that to make you feel easy, like in case you did hear anything. You were all alone on the floor. Say now," she went on, after a pause in which Shorthouse could think of nothing to say but unpublishable things. "Say now, do tell, did you feel sort of cold when the show was on? Sort of tired and weak, I mean, as if you might be going to die?" "How can I say?" he answered savagely. "What I felt God only knows." "Vol, but he won't tell," she drawled out. "Only I was wondering how you really did feel, because the man who had that room last was found one morning in bed." "In bed? He was dead. He was the one before you." "Oh, you don't need to get rattled so. You're all right. And it all really happened, they do say." This house used to be a private residence some 25 years ago, and a German family of the name of Steinhardt lived here. They had a big business in Wall Street and stood way up in things. Ah, said her listener. Oh yes, they did. Right at the top, till one fine day it all bust and the old man skipped with the boodle. Skipped with the boodle? That's so, she said, got clear away with all the money, and the son was found dead in his house. Committed suicide, it was thought. Though there was some as said he couldn't have stabbed himself and fallen in that position. They said he was murdered. The father died in prison. They tried to fasten the murder on him, but there was no motive or no evidence or no something. I forget now. Very pretty, said Shorthouse. I'll show you something mighty queer anyways, she drawled, if you'll come upstairs a minute. I've heard the steps and voices lots of times. They don't fees me any. I just as lief hear so many dogs barking. You'll find the whole story in the newspapers if you look it up. Not what goes on here, but the story of the Germans. My house would be ruined if they told all, and I'd sue for damages. They reached the bedroom, and the woman went in and pulled up the edge of the carpet where Shorthouse had seen the blood soaking in the previous night. Look thar if you feel like it, said the old hag. Stooping down, he saw a dark, dull stain in the boards that corresponded exactly to the shape and position of the blood as he had seen it. That night, he slept in a hotel, and the following day sought new quarters. In the newspapers on file in his office after a long search, he found 20 years back the detailed story, substantially as the woman had said, of Steinhardt and Company's failure, the absconding and subsequent arrest of the senior partner, and the suicide or murder of his son Otto. The landlady's room house had formerly been their private residence. Keeping his promise, it was 11 o'clock at night, and young Marriott was locked into his room, cramming as hard as he could cram. He was a fourth-year man at Edinburgh University, and he had been plowed for this particular examination so often that his parents had positively declared they could no longer supply the funds to keep him there. His rooms were cheap and dingy, but it was the lecture fees that took the money. So Marriott pulled himself together at last and definitely made up his mind that he would pass or die in the attempt. And for some weeks now, he had been reading as hard as mortal man can read. He was trying to make up for lost time and money in a way that showed conclusively he did not understand the value of either. For no ordinary man, and Marriott was in every sense an ordinary man, can afford to drive the mind as he had lately been driving his, without sooner or later paying the cost. Among the students, he had few friends or acquaintances, and these few had promised not to disturb him at night, knowing he was at last reading in earnest. It was, therefore, with feelings a good deal stronger than mere surprise that he heard his doorbell ring on this particular night and realized that he was to have a visitor. Some men would simply have muffled the bell and gone on quietly with their work. But Marriott was not this sort. He was nervous. It would have bothered and pecked at his mind all night long not to know who the visitor was and what he wanted. The only thing to do, therefore, was to let him in and out again as quickly as possible. The landlady went to bed at 10 o'clock punctually, after which hour nothing would induce her to pretend she heard the bell. So Marriott jumped up from his books with an exclamation that augured ill for the reception of his caller, and prepared to let him in with his own hand. The streets of Edinburgh town were very still at this late hour. It was late for Edinburgh, and in the quiet neighborhood of F Street, where Marriott lived on the third floor, scarcely a sound broke the silence. As he crossed the floor, the bell rang a second time, with unnecessary clamor, and he unlocked the door and passed into the little hallway with considerable wrath and annoyance in his heart at the insolence of the double interruption. The fellows all know I'm reading for this exam. Why in the world do they come to bother me at such an unearthly hour? The inhabitants of the building, with himself, were medical students, general students, poor writers to the signet, and some others whose vocations were perhaps not so obvious. The stone staircase, dimly lighted at each floor by a gas jet that would not turn above a certain height, wound down to the level of the street with no pretense at carpet or railing. At some levels, it was cleaner than at others. It depended on the landlady of the particular level. The acoustic properties of spiral staircase seemed to be peculiar. Marriott, standing by the open door, book in hand, thought every moment the owner of the footsteps would come into view. The sound of the boots was so close and so loud that they seemed to travel disproportionately in advance of their cause. Wondering who it could be, he stood ready with all manner of sharp greetings for the man who dared thus to disturb his work. But the man did not appear. The steps sounded almost under his nose, yet no one was visible. A sudden queer sensation of fear passed over him, a faintness and a shiver down the back. It went, however, almost as soon as it came, and he was just debating whether he would call aloud to his invisible visitor or slam the door and return to his books, when the cause of the disturbance turned the corner very slowly and came into view. It was a stranger. He saw a youngish man short of figure and very broad. His face was the color of a piece of chalk, and the eyes, which were very bright, had heavy lines underneath them. Though the cheeks and chin were unshaven and the general appearance unkempt, the man was evidently a gentleman, for he was well dressed and bore himself with a certain air. But, strangest of all, he wore no hat and carried none in his hand, and although rain had been falling steadily all the evening, he appeared to have neither overcoat nor umbrella. 100 questions sprang up in Marriott's mind and rushed to his lips, chief among which was something like, "Who in the world are you? And what in the name of heaven do you come to me for?" But none of these questions found time to express themselves in words, for almost at once the caller turned his head a little so that the gas light in the hall fell upon his features from a new angle. Then in a flash Marriott recognized him. "Field, man alive, is it you?" he gasped. The fourth-year man was not lacking in intuition, and he perceived at once that here was a case for delicate treatment. He divined, without any actual process of thought, that the catastrophe often predicted had come at last, and that this man's father had turned him out of the house. They had been at a private school together years before, and though they had hardly met once since, the news had not failed to reach him from time to time with considerable detail, for the family lived near his own, and between certain of the sisters there was great intimacy. Young Field had gone wild later. He remembered hearing about it all: drink, a woman, opium, or something of the sort. He could not exactly call to mind. "Come in," he said at once, his anger vanishing. "There's been something wrong, I can see. Come in, and tell me all about it, and perhaps I can help." He hardly knew what to say, and stammered a lot more besides. The dark side of life, and the horror of it, belonged to a world that lay remote from his own select little atmosphere of books and dreamings. But he had a man's heart for all that. He led the way across the hall, shutting the front door carefully behind him, and noticed as he did so that the other, though certainly sober, was unsteady on his legs and evidently much exhausted. Marriott might not be able to pass his examinations, but he at least knew the symptoms of starvation, acute starvation, unless he was much mistaken when they stared him in the face. "Come along," he said cheerfully and with genuine sympathy in his voice. "I'm glad to see you. I was going to have a bite of something to eat, and you're just in time to join me." The other made no audible reply, and shuffled so feebly with his feet that Marriott took his arm by way of support. He noticed for the first time that the clothes hung on him with pitiful looseness. The broad frame was literally hardly more than a frame. He was as thin as a skeleton. But, as he touched him, the sensation of faintness and dread returned. It only lasted a moment, and then passed off, and he ascribed it not unnaturally to the distress and shock of seeing a former friend in such a pitiful plight. "Better let me guide you. It's shamefully dark, this hall. I'm always complaining," he said lightly, recognizing by the weight upon his arm that the guidance was sorely needed, but the old cat never does anything except promise. He led him to the sofa, wondering all the time where he had come from and how he had found out the address. It must be at least 7 years since those days at the private school, when they used to be such close friends. "Now, if you'll forgive me for a minute," he said, "I'll get supper ready, such as it is. And don't bother to talk. Just take it easy on the sofa. I see you're dead tired. You can tell me about it afterwards, and we'll make plans." The other sat down on the edge of the sofa and stared in silence, while Marriott got out the brown loaf, scones, and huge pot of marmalade that Edinburgh students always keep in their cupboards. His eyes shone with a brightness that suggested drugs, Marriott thought, stealing a glance at him from behind the cupboard door. He did not like it to take a full square look. The fellow was in a bad way, and it would have been so like an examination to stare and wait for explanations. Besides, he was evidently almost too exhausted to speak. So, for reasons of delicacy, and for another reason as well which he could not exactly formulate to himself, he let his visitor rest apparently unnoticed while he busied himself with the supper. He lit the spirit lamp to make cocoa, and when the water was boiling he drew up the table with the good things to the sofa, so that Field need not have even the trouble of moving to a chair. "Now, let's tuck in," he said, "and afterwards we'll have a pipe and a chat. I'm reading for an exam, you know, and I always have something about this time. It's jolly to have a companion." He looked up and caught his guest's eyes directed straight upon his own. An involuntary shudder ran through him from head to foot. The face opposite him was deadly white and wore a dreadful expression of pain and mental suffering. "By gad," he said, jumping up, "I quite forgot. I've got some whiskey somewhere. What an ass I am. I never touch it myself when I'm working like this." He went to the cupboard and poured out a stiff glass, which the other swallowed at a single gulp and without any water. Marriott watched him while he drank it, and at the same time noticed something else as well. Field's coat was all over dust, and on one shoulder was a bit of cobweb. It was perfectly dry. Field arrived on a soaking wet night without hat, umbrella, or overcoat, and yet perfectly dry, even dusty. Therefore he had been under cover. What did it all mean? Had he been hiding in the building? It was very strange. Yet he volunteered nothing, and Marriott had pretty well made up his mind by this time that he would not ask any questions until he had eaten and slept. Food and sleep were obviously what the poor devil needed most and first. He was pleased with his powers of ready diagnosis, and it would not be fair to press him till he had recovered a bit. They ate their supper together, while the host carried on a running one-sided conversation, chiefly about himself and his exams and his old cat of a landlady, so that the guest need not utter a single word unless he really wished to, which he evidently did not. But while he toyed with his food, feeling no desire to eat, the other ate voraciously. To see a hungry man devour cold scones, stale oat cake, and brown bread laden with marmalade was a revelation to this inexperienced student who had never known what it was to be without at least 3 meals a day. He watched in spite of himself, wondering why the fellow did not choke in the process. But Field seemed to be as sleepy as he was hungry. More than once his head dropped, and he ceased to masticate the food in his mouth. Marriott had positively to shake him before he would go on with his meal. A stronger emotion will overcome a weaker, but this struggle between the sting of real hunger and the magical opiate of overpowering sleep was a curious sight to the student, who watched it with mingled astonishment and alarm. He had heard of the pleasure it was to feed hungry men and watch them eat, but he had never actually witnessed it, and he had no idea it was like this. Field ate like an animal, gobbled, stuffed, gorged. Marriott forgot his reading and began to feel something very much like a lump in his throat. "Afraid there's been awfully little to offer you, old man," he managed to blurt out when at length the last scone had disappeared and the rapid, one-sided meal was at an end. Field still made no reply, for he was almost asleep in his seat. He merely looked up wearily and gratefully. "Now you must have some sleep, you know," he continued, "or you'll go to pieces. I shall be up all night reading for this blessed exam. You're more than welcome to my bed. Tomorrow we'll have a late breakfast and see what can be done, and make plans. I'm awfully good at making plans, you know," he added with an attempt at lightness. Field maintained his dead sleepy silence, but appeared to acquiesce, and the other led the way into the bedroom, apologizing as he did so to this half-starved son of a baronet, whose own home was almost a palace, for the size of the room. The weary guest, however, made no pretense of thanks or politeness. He merely steadied himself on his friend's arm as he staggered across the room, and then, with all his clothes on, dropped his exhausted body on the bed. In less than a minute, he was to all appearances sound asleep. For several minutes Marriott stood in the open door and watched him, praying devoutly that he might never find himself in a like predicament, and then fell to wondering what he would do with his unbidden guest on the morrow. But he did not stop long to think, for the call of his books was imperative, and happen what might, he must see to it that he passed that examination. Having again locked the door into the hall, he sat down to his books and resumed his notes on materia medica, where he had left off when the bell rang. But it was difficult for some time to concentrate his mind on the subject. His thoughts kept wandering to the picture of that white-faced, strange-eyed fellow, starved and dirty, lying in his clothes and boots on the bed. He recalled their school days together before they had drifted apart, and how they had vowed eternal friendship, and all the rest of it. And now, what horrible straits to be in. How could any man let the love of dissipation take such hold upon him? But one of their vows together married, it seemed, had completely forgotten. Just now, at any rate, it lay too far in the background of his memory to be recalled. Through the half-open door, the bedroom led out of the sitting room and had no other door, came the sound of deep, long-drawn breathing, the regular, steady breathing of a tired man, so tired that, even to listen to it made Marriott almost want to go to sleep himself. He needed it, reflected the student, and perhaps it came only just in time. Perhaps so, for outside the bitter wind from across the Forth howled cruelly and drove the rain in cold streams against the window panes and down the deserted streets. Long before Marriott settled down again properly to his reading, he heard distantly, as it were, through the sentences of the book, the heavy, deep breathing of the sleeper in the next room. A couple of hours later, when he yawned and changed his books, he still heard the breathing and went cautiously up to the door to look round. At first, the darkness of the room must have deceived him, or else his eyes were confused and dazzled by the recent glare of the reading lamp. For a minute or two, he could make out nothing at all but dark lumps of furniture, the mass of the chest of drawers by the wall, and the white patch where his bath stood in the center of the floor. Then the bed came slowly into view, and on it he saw the outline of the sleeping body gradually take shape before his eyes, growing up strangely into the darkness, till it stood out in marked relief, the long black form against the white counterpane. He could hardly help smiling. Field had not moved an inch. He watched him a moment or two and then returned to his books. The night was full of the singing voices of the wind and rain. There was no sound of traffic, no hansoms clattered over the cobbles, and it was still too early for the milk carts. He worked on steadily and conscientiously, only stopping now and again to change a book or to sip some of the poisonous stuff that kept him awake and made his brain so active, and on these occasions Field's breathing was always distinctly audible in the room. Outside, the storm continued to howl, but inside the house all was stillness. The shade of the reading lamp threw all the light upon the littered table, leaving the other end of the room in comparative darkness. The bedroom door was exactly opposite him where he sat. There was nothing to disturb the worker, nothing but an occasional rush of wind against the windows and a slight pain in his arm. This pain, however, which he was unable to account for, grew once or twice very acute. It bothered him, and he tried to remember how and when he could have bruised himself so severely, but without success. At length the page before him turned from yellow to gray, and there were sounds of wheels in the street below. It was 4 o'clock. Marriott leaned back and yawned prodigiously. Then he drew back the curtains. The storm had subsided, and the castle rock was shrouded in mist. With another yawn, he turned away from the dreary outlook and prepared to sleep the remaining 4 hours till breakfast on the sofa. Field was still breathing heavily in the next room, and he first tiptoed across the floor to take another look at him. Peering cautiously round the half-open door, his first glance fell upon the bed, now plainly discernible in the gray light of morning. He stared hard. Then he rubbed his eyes. Then he rubbed his eyes again and thrust his head farther round the edge of the door. With fixed eyes he stared harder still and harder. But it made no difference at all. He was staring into an empty room. The sensation of fear he had felt when Field first appeared upon the scene returned suddenly, but with much greater force. He became conscious, too, that his left arm was throbbing violently and causing him great pain. He stood wondering and staring and tried to collect his thoughts. He was trembling from head to foot. By a great effort of the will he left the support of the door and walked forward boldly into the room. There upon the bed was the impress of a body where Field had lain and slept. There was the mark of the head on the pillow and the slight indentation at the foot of the bed where the boots had rested on the counterpane. And there, plainer than ever, for he was closer to it, was the breathing. Marriott tried to pull himself together. With a great effort, he found his voice and called his friend aloud by name. "Field, is it you? Where are you?" There was no reply, but the breathing continued without interruption, coming directly from the bed. His voice had such an unfamiliar sound that Marriott did not care to repeat his questions, but he went down on his knees and examined the bed above and below, pulling the mattress off finally and taking the coverings away separately one by one. But though the sounds continued, there was no visible sign of Field, nor was there any space in which a human being, however small, could have concealed itself. He pulled the bed out from the wall, but the sound stayed where it was. It did not move with the bed. Marriott, finding self-control a little difficult in his weary condition, at once set about a thorough search of the room. He went through the cupboard, the chest of drawers, the little alcove where the clothes hung, everything. But there was no sign of anyone. The small window near the ceiling was closed, and, anyhow, was not large enough to let a cat pass. The sitting room door was locked on the inside. He could not have got out that way. Curious thoughts began to trouble Marriott's mind, bringing in their train unwelcome sensations. He grew more and more excited. He searched the bed again till it resembled the scene of a pillow fight. He searched both rooms, knowing all the time it was useless, and then he searched again. A cold perspiration broke out all over his body, and the sound of heavy breathing, all this time, never ceased to come from the corner where Field had lain down to sleep. Then he tried something else. He pushed the bed back exactly into its original position, and himself laid down upon it just where his guest had lain. But the same instant he sprang up again in a single bound. The breathing was close beside him, almost on his cheek, and between him and the wall. Not even a child could have squeezed into the space. He went back into his sitting room, opened the windows, welcoming all the light and air possible, and tried to think the whole matter over quietly and clearly. Men who read too hard and slept too little, he knew, were sometimes troubled with very vivid hallucinations. Again he calmly reviewed every incident of the night, his accurate sensations, the vivid details, the emotions stirred in him, the dreadful feast. No single hallucination could ever combine all these and cover so long a period of time. But with less satisfaction, he thought of the recurring faintness and curious sense of horror that had once or twice come over him, and then of the violent pains in his arm. These were quite unaccountable. Moreover, now that he began to analyze and examine, there was one other thing that fell upon him like a sudden revelation. During the whole time, Field had not actually uttered a single word, yet, as though in mockery upon his reflections, there came ever from that inner room the sound of the breathing, long-drawn, deep, and regular. The thing was incredible. It was absurd. Haunted by visions of brain fever and insanity, Marriott put on his cap and mackintosh and left the house. The morning air on Arthur's seat would blow the cobwebs from his brain, the scent of the heather, and above all, the sight of the sea. He roamed over the wet slopes above Holyrood for a couple of hours, and did not return until the exercise had shaken some of the horror out of his bones, and given him a ravening appetite into the bargain. As he entered, he saw that there was another man in the room, standing against the window with his back to the light. He recognized his fellow student Green, who was reading for the same examination. "Read hard all night, Marriott," he said, "and thought I'd drop in here to compare notes and have some breakfast. You're out early?" he added, by way of question. Marriott said he had a headache and a walk had helped it, and Green nodded and said, "Ah." But when the girl had set the steaming porridge on the table and gone out again, he went on with rather a forced tone. "Didn't know you had any friends who drank, Marriott?" This was obviously tentative, and Marriott replied drily that he did not know it either. "Sounds just as if some chap were sleeping it off in there, doesn't it, though?" persisted the other, with a nod in the direction of the bedroom, and looking curiously at his friend. The two men stared steadily at each other for several seconds, and then Marriott said earnestly, "Then you hear it too? Thank God. Of course I hear it. The door's open. Sorry if I wasn't meant to." "Oh, I don't mean that," said Marriott, lowering his voice. "But I'm awfully relieved. Let me explain. Of course, if you hear it too, then it's all right, but really it frightened me more than I can tell you. I thought I was going to have brain fever or something, and you know what, a lot depends on this exam. It always begins with sounds or visions or some sort of beastly hallucination, and rot, ejaculated the other impatiently. "What are you talking about?" "Now, listen to me, Green," said Marriott, as calmly as he could, for the breathing was still plainly audible, "and I'll tell you what I mean, only don't interrupt." And thereupon he related exactly what had happened during the night, telling everything, even down to the pain in his arm. When it was over, he got up from the table and crossed the room. "You hear the breathing now plainly, don't you?" he said. Green said he did. "Well, come with me, and we'll search the room together." The other, however, did not move from his chair. "I've been in already," he said sheepishly. "I heard the sounds and thought it was you." The door was ajar, so I went in. Maria made no comment, but pushed the door open as wide as it would go. As it opened, the sound of breathing grew more and more distinct. "Someone must be in there," said Green under his breath. "Someone is in there, but where?" said Marriott. Again, he urged his friend to go in with him. But Green refused point blank, said he'd been in once and had searched the room, and there was nothing there. He would not go in again for a good deal. They shut the door and retired into the other room to talk it all over with many pipes. Green questioned his friend very closely, but without illuminating result, since questions cannot alter facts. "The only thing that ought to have a logical explanation is the pain in my arm," said Marriott, rubbing that member with an attempt at a smile. "It hurts so infernally and aches all the way up. I can't remember bruising it, though." "Let me examine it for you," said Green. "I'm awfully good at bones in spite of the examiner's opinion to the contrary." It was a relief to play the fool a bit, and Marriott took his coat off and rolled up his sleeve. "By George, though, I'm bleeding," he exclaimed. "Look here. What on earth's this?" On the forearm, quite close to the wrist, was a thin red line. There was a tiny drop of apparently fresh blood on it. Green came over and looked closely at it for some minutes. Then he sat back in his chair, looking curiously at his friend's face. "You've scratched yourself without knowing it," he said presently. "There's no sign of a bruise. It must be something else that made the arm ache." Marriott sat very still, staring silently at his arm, as though the solution of the whole mystery lay there actually written upon the skin. "What's the matter?" "I see nothing very strange about a scratch," said Green, in an unconvincing sort of voice. "It was your cuff links, probably. Last night, in your excitement." But Marriott, white to the very lips, was trying to speak. The sweat stood in great beads on his forehead. At last he leaned forward close to his friend's face. "Look," he said, in a low voice that shook a little. "Do you see that red mark? I mean underneath what you call the scratch." Green admitted he saw something or other, and Marriott wiped the place clean with his handkerchief and told him to look again more closely. "Yes, I see," returned the other, lifting his head after a moment's careful inspection. "It looks like an old scar." "It is an old scar," whispered Marriott, his lips trembling. "Now it all comes back to me." "All what?" Green fidgeted on his chair. He tried to laugh, but without success. His friend seemed bordering on collapse. "Hush, be quiet, and I'll tell you," he said. "Field made that scar." For a whole minute, the two men looked each other full in the face without speaking. "Field made that scar," repeated Marriott at length in a louder voice. "Field? You mean last night?" "No, not last night. Years ago, at school with his knife. And I made a scar on his arm with mine." Marriott was talking rapidly now. "We exchanged drops of blood in each other's cuts. He put a drop into my arm, and I put one into his. In the name of heaven, what for? It was a boys' compact. We made a sacred pledge, a bargain. I remember it all perfectly now. We had been reading some dreadful book, and we swore to appear to one another. I mean, whoever died first swore to show himself to the other. And we sealed the compact with each other's blood. I remember it all so well. The hot summer afternoon in the playground, 7 years ago, and one of the masters caught us and confiscated the knives, and I have never thought of it again to this day." "And you mean," stammered Green. But Marriott made no answer. He got up and crossed the room and lay down wearily upon the sofa, hiding his face in his hands. Green himself was a bit nonplussed. He left his friend alone for a little while, thinking it all over again. Suddenly an idea seemed to strike him. He went over to where Marriott still lay motionless on the sofa and roused him. In any case, it was better to face the matter, whether there was an explanation or not. Giving in was always the silly exit. "I say, Marriott," he began, as the other turned his white face up to him. "There's no good being so upset about it. I mean, if it's all an hallucination, we know what to do. And if it isn't, well, we know what to think, don't we?" "I suppose so, but it frightens me horribly for some reason," returned his friend in a hushed voice. "And that poor devil. But, after all, if the worst is true and that chap has kept his promise, well, he has, that's all, isn't it?" Marriott nodded. "There's only one thing that occurs to me," Green went on, "and that is, are you quite sure that he really ate like that? I mean, that he actually ate anything at all?" he finished, blurting out all his thought. Marriott stared at him for a moment, and then said he could easily make certain. He spoke quietly. After the main shock, no lesser surprise could affect him. "I put the things away myself," he said, after we had finished. "They're on the third shelf in that cupboard. No one's touched them since." He pointed without getting up, and Green took the hint and went over to look. "Exactly," he said, after a brief examination. "Just as I thought. It was partly hallucination, at any rate. The things haven't been touched. Come and see for yourself." Together, they examined the shelf. There was the brown loaf, the plate of stale scones, the oatcake, all untouched. Even the glass of whiskey Marriott had poured out stood there with the whiskey still in it. "You were feeding no one," said Green. "Field ate and drank nothing. He was not there at all." "But the breathing?" urged the other in a low voice, staring with a dazed expression on his face. Green did not answer. He walked over to the bedroom, while Marriott followed him with his eyes. He opened the door and listened. There was no need for words. The sound of deep, regular breathing came floating through the air. There was no hallucination about that, at any rate. Marriott could hear it where he stood on the other side of the room. Green closed the door and came back. "There's only one thing to do," he declared with decision. "Write home and find out about him, and meanwhile come and finish your reading in my rooms. I've got an extra bed." "Agreed," returned the fourth-year man. "There's no hallucination about that exam. I must pass that whatever happens." And this was what they did. It was about a week later when Marriott got the answer from his sister. Part of it he read out to Green. "It is curious," she wrote, "that in your letter you should have inquired after Field. It seems a terrible thing, but you know only a short while ago Sir John's patience became exhausted, and he turned him out of the house, they say without a penny. Well, what do you think? He has killed himself. At least it looks like suicide. Instead of leaving the house, he went down into the cellar and simply starved himself to death. They're trying to suppress it, of course, but I heard it all from my maid, who got it from their footman. They found the body on the 14th, and the doctor said he had died about 12 hours before. He was dreadfully thin." "Then he died on the 13th, said Green. Marriott nodded. "That's the very night he came to see you." Marriott nodded again, with intent to steal. To sleep in a lonely barn when the best bedrooms in the house were at our disposal seemed, to say the least, unnecessary, and I felt that some explanation was due to our host. But Shorthouse, I soon discovered, had seen to all that. Our enterprise would be tolerated, not welcomed, for the master kept this sort of thing down with a firm hand. And then, how little I could get this man, Shorthouse, to tell me. There was much I wanted to ask and hear, but he surrounded himself with impossible barriers. It was ludicrous. He was surely asking a good deal of me, and yet he would give so little in return, and his reason, that it was for my good, may have been perfectly true, but did not bring me any comfort in its train. He gave me sops now and then, however, to keep up my curiosity, till I soon was aware that there were growing up side by side within me a genuine interest and an equally genuine fear. And something of both these is probably necessary to all real excitement. The barn in question was some distance from the house, on the side of the stables, and I had passed it on several of my journeyings to and fro, wondering at its forlorn and untarred appearance under a regime where everything was so spick and span. But it had never once occurred to me as possible that I should come to spend a night under its roof with a comparative stranger, and undergo there an experience belonging to an order of things I had always rather ridiculed and despised. At the moment, I can only partially recall the process by which Shorthouse persuaded me to lend him my company. Like myself, he was a guest in this autumn house party, and where there were so many to chatter and to chaff, I think his taciturnity of manner had appealed to me by contrast, and that I wished to repay something of what I owed. There was no doubt flattery in it as well, for he was more than twice my age, a man of amazingly wide experience, an explorer of all the world's corners where danger lurked, and, most subtle flattery of all, by far the best shot in the whole party, our host included. At first, however, I held out a bit. "But surely this story you tell," I said, "has the parentage common to all such tales, a superstitious heart and an imaginative brain, and has grown now by frequent repetition into an authentic ghost story? Besides, this head gardener of half a century ago," I added, seeing that he still went on cleaning his gun in silence, "who was he? And what positive information have you about him beyond the fact that he was found hanging from the rafters dead?" "He was no mere head gardener, this man who passed as such," he replied without looking up, "but a fellow of splendid education who used this curious disguise for his own purposes. Part of this very barn, of which he always kept the key, was found to have been fitted up as a complete laboratory, with athanor, alembic, cucurbite, and other appliances, some of which the master destroyed at once, perhaps for the best, and which I have only been able to guess at." "Black arts," I laughed. "Who knows?" he rejoined quietly. "The man undoubtedly possessed knowledge, dark knowledge, that was most unusual and dangerous, and I could discover no means by which he came to it. No ordinary means, that is. But I have found many facts in the case which point to the exercise of a most desperate and unscrupulous will, and the strange disappearances in the neighborhood, as well as the bones found buried in the kitchen garden, though never actually traced to him, seem to me full of dreadful suggestion." I laughed again, a little uncomfortably perhaps, and said it reminded one of the story of Giles de Ray's, Marechal of France, who is said to have killed and tortured to death in a few years no less than 160 women and children for the purposes of necromancy, and who was executed for his crimes at Nantes. But Shorthouse would not rise, and only returned to his subject. "His suicide seems to have been only just in time to escape arrest," he said. "A magician of no high order then," I observed skeptically, "if suicide was his only way of evading the country police." "The police of London and St. Petersburg, rather," returned Shorthouse, "for the headquarters of this pretty company was somewhere in Russia, and his apparatus all bore the marks of the most skillful foreign make. A Russian woman then employed in the household, governess, or something, vanished too, about the same time, and was never caught. She was no doubt the cleverest of the lot. And, remember, the object of this appalling group was not mere vulgar gain, but a kind of knowledge that called for the highest qualities of courage and intellect in the seekers. I admit I was impressed by the man's conviction of voice and manner, for there is something very compelling in the force of an earnest man's belief, though I still affected to sneer politely. But, like most black magicians, the fellow only succeeded in compassing his own destruction, that of his tools, rather, and of escaping himself, so that he might better accomplish his objects elsewhere and otherwise, said Shorthouse, giving, as he spoke, the most minute attention to the cleaning of the lock. "Elsewhere and otherwise," I gasped, as if the shell he left hanging from the rafter in the barn in no way impeded the man's spirit from continuing his dreadful work under new conditions, he added quietly, without noticing my interruption. "The idea being that he sometimes revisits the garden and the barn, chiefly the barn." "The barn," I exclaimed. "For what purpose?" "Chiefly the barn," he finished, as if he had not heard me. "That is, when there is anybody in it." I stared at him without speaking, for there was a wonder in me how he would add to this. "When he wants fresh material, that is, he comes to steal from the living." "Fresh material," I repeated aghast. to steal from the living. Even then, in broad daylight, I was foolishly conscious of a creeping sensation at the roots of my hair, as if a cold breeze were passing over my skull. The strong vitality of the living is what this sort of creature is supposed to need most, he went on imperturbably, and where he has worked and thought and struggled before is the easiest place for him to get it in. The former conditions are in some way more easily reconstructed. He stopped suddenly and devoted all his attention to the gun. It's difficult to explain, rather, he added presently. And besides, it's much better that you should not know till afterwards. I made a noise that was the beginning of a score of questions and of as many sentences, but it got no further than a mere noise, and Shorthouse, of course, stepped in again. Your skepticism, he added, is one of the qualities that induced me to ask you to spend the night there with me. In those days, he went on, in response to my urging for more information, the family were much abroad and often traveled for years at a time. This man was invaluable in their absence. His wonderful knowledge of horticulture kept the gardens, French, Italian, English, in perfect order. He had carte blanche in the matter of expense, and of course selected all his own underlings. It was the sudden, unexpected return of the master that surprised the amazing stories of the countryside before the fellow, with all his cleverness, had time to prepare or conceal. But is there no evidence, no more recent evidence, to show that something is likely to happen if we sit up there? I asked, pressing him yet further, and, I think to his liking, for it showed at least that I was interested. Has anything happened there lately, for instance? Shorthouse glanced up from the gun he was cleaning so assiduously, and the smoke from his pipe curled up into an odd twist between me and the black beard and oriental suntan face. The magnetism of his look and expression brought more sense of conviction to me than I had felt hitherto, and I realized that there had been a sudden little change in my attitude, and that I was now much more inclined to go in for the adventure with him. At least, I thought, with such a man, one would be safe in any emergency, for he is determined, resourceful, and to be depended upon. There's the point, he answered slowly, for there has apparently been a fresh outburst, an attack almost, it seems, quite recently. There is evidence, of course, plenty of it, or I should not feel the interest I do feel, but he hesitated a moment, as though considering how much he ought to let me know. But the fact is that 3 men this summer on separate occasions who have gone into that barn after nightfall have been accosted. Accosted, I repeated, betrayed into the interruption by his choice of so singular a word. And one of the stablemen, a recent arrival and quite ignorant of the story, who had to go in there late one night, saw a dark substance hanging down from one of the rafters, and when he climbed up, shaking all over, to cut it down, for he said he felt sure it was a corpse, the knife passed through nothing but air, and he heard a sound up under the eaves, as if someone were laughing. Yet, while he slashed away, and afterwards too, the thing went on swinging there before his eyes and turning slowly with its own weight, like a huge joint on a spit. The man declares, too, that it had a large bearded face, and that the mouth was open and drawn down like the mouth of a hanged man. Can we question this fellow? He's gone. Gave notice at once, but not before I had questioned him myself very closely. Then this was quite recent, I said, for I knew Shorthouse had not been in the house more than a week. 4 days ago, he replied. But more than that. Only 3 days ago a couple of men were in there together in full daylight when one of them suddenly turned deadly faint. He said that he felt an overmastering impulse to hang himself, and he looked about for a rope and was furious when his companion tried to prevent him. But he did prevent him, just in time, but not before he had clambered onto a beam. He was very violent. I had so much to say and ask that I could get nothing out in time, and Shorthouse went on again. I've had a sort of watching brief for this case, he said with a smile, whose real significance, however, completely escaped me at the time, and one of the most disagreeable features about it is the deliberate way the servants have invented excuses to go out to the place, and always after dark. Some of them who have no right to go there, and no real occasion at all, have never been there in their lives before probably, and now all of a sudden have shown the keenest desire and determination to go out there about dusk or soon after and with the most paltry and foolish excuses in the world. Of course, he added, they have been prevented, but the desire, stronger than their superstitious dread, and which they cannot explain, is very curious. Very, I admitted, feeling that my hair was beginning to stand up again. You see, he went on presently, it all points to volition, in fact to deliberate arrangement. It is no mere family ghost that goes with every IV'd house in England of a certain age. It is something real and something very malignant. He raised his face from the gun barrel, and for the first time as I caught mine in the full. Yes, he was very much in earnest. Also, he knew a great deal more than he meant to tell. It's worth tempting and fighting, I think, he said, but I want a companion with me. Are you game? His enthusiasm undoubtedly caught me, but I still wanted to hedge a bit. I'm very skeptical, I pleaded. All the better, he said, almost as if to himself. You have the pluck. I have the knowledge. The knowledge. He looked round cautiously, as if to make sure that there was no one within earshot. I've been in the place myself, he said in a lowered voice, quite lately. In fact, only 3 nights ago, the day the man turned queer. I stared, but it was obliged to come out. Still I stared. Quickly, he added significantly. You've gone into the thing pretty thoroughly, was all I could find to say, for I had almost made up my mind to go with him, and was not sure that I wanted to hear too much beforehand. He nodded. It's a bore, of course, but I must do everything thoroughly, or not at all. That's why you clean your own gun, I suppose. That's why, when there's any danger, I take as few chances as possible, he said, with the same enigmatical smile I had noticed before. And then he added with emphasis, and that is also why I ask you to keep me company now. Of course, the shaft went straight home, and I gave my promise without further ado. Our preparations for the night, a couple of rugs and a flask of black coffee, were not elaborate, and we found no difficulty, about 10 o'clock, in absenting ourselves from the billiard room without attracting curiosity. Shorthouse met me by arrangement under the cedar on the back lawn, and I at once realized with vividness what a difference there is between making plans in the daytime and carrying them out in the dark. One's common sense, at least in matters of this sort, is reduced to a minimum, and imagination with all her attendant sprites usurps the place of judgment. 2 and 2 no longer make 4. They make a mystery, and the mystery loses no time in growing into a menace. In this particular case, however, my imagination did not find wings very readily, for I knew that my companion was the most unmovable of men, an unemotional, solid block of a man who would never lose his head, and in any conceivable state of affairs would always take the right as well as the strong course. So my faith in the man gave me a false courage that was nevertheless very consoling, and I looked forward to the night's adventure with a genuine appetite. Side by side, and in silence, we followed the path that skirted the east woods, as they were called, and then led across 2 hay fields, and through another wood, to the barn, which thus lay about half a mile from the lower farm. To the lower farm, indeed, it properly belonged, and this made us realize more clearly how very ingenious must have been the excuses of the hall servants who felt a desire to visit it. It had been raining during the late afternoon, and the trees were still dripping heavily on all sides, but the moment we left the second wood and came out into the open, we saw a clearing with the stars overhead, against which the barn outlined itself in a black, lugubrious shadow. Shorthouse led the way, still without a word, and we crawled in through a low door and seated ourselves in a soft heap of hay in the extreme corner. Now, he said, speaking for the first time, I'll show you the inside of the barn, so that you may know where you are and what to do in case anything happens. A match flared in the darkness, and with the help of 2 more that followed, I saw the interior of a lofty and somewhat rickety-looking barn, erected upon a wall of gray stones that ran all round and extended to a height of perhaps 4 feet. Above this masonry rose the wooden sides, running up into the usual vaulted roof, and supported by a double tier of massive oak rafters, which stretched across from wall to wall and were intersected by occasional uprights. I felt as if we were inside the skeleton of some antediluvian monster whose huge black ribs completely enfolded us. Most of this, of course, only sketched itself to my eye in the uncertain light of the flickering matches, and when I said I had seen enough, and the matches went out, we were at once enveloped in an atmosphere as densely black as anything that I have ever known. And the silence equaled the darkness. We made ourselves comfortable and talked in low voices. The rugs, which were very large, covered our legs, and our shoulders sank into a really luxurious bed of softness. Yet neither of us apparently felt sleepy. I certainly didn't, and Shorthouse, dropping his customary brevity that fell little short of gruffness, plunged into an easy run of talking that took the form, after a time, of personal reminiscences. This rapidly became a vivid narration of adventure and travel in far countries. And at any other time, I should have allowed myself to become completely absorbed in what he told. But, unfortunately, I was never able for a single instant to forget the real purpose of our enterprise, and consequently, I felt all my senses more keenly on the alert than usual, and my attention accordingly more or less distracted. It was indeed a revelation to hear Shorthouse unbosom himself in this fashion, and to a young man it was of course doubly fascinating. But the little sounds that always punctuate even the deepest silence out of doors claimed some portion of my attention, and as the night grew on, I soon became aware that his tales seemed somewhat disconnected and abrupt, and that, in fact, I heard really only part of them. It was not so much that I actually heard other sounds, but that I expected to hear them. This was what stole the other half of my listening. There was neither wind nor rain to break the stillness, and certainly there were no physical presences in our neighborhood, for we were half a mile even from the lower farm, and from the hall and stables at least a mile. Yet the stillness was being continually broken, perhaps disturbed is a better word, and it was to these very remote and tiny disturbances that I felt compelled to devote at least half my listening faculties. From time to time, however, I made a remark or asked a question to show that I was listening and interested, but in a sense, my questions always seemed to bear in one direction and to make for one issue, namely, my companion's previous experience in the barn when he had been obliged to come out quickly. Apparently, I could not help myself in the matter, for this was really the one consuming curiosity I had, and the fact that it was better for me not to know it made me the keener to know it all, even the worst. Shorthouse realized this even better than I did. I could tell it by the way he dodged, or wholly ignored, my questions, and this subtle sympathy between us showed plainly enough, had I been able at the time to reflect upon its meaning, that the nerves of both of us were in a very sensitive and highly strung condition. Probably, the complete confidence I felt in his ability to face whatever might happen, and the extent to which also I relied upon him for my own courage, prevented the exercise of my ordinary powers of reflection, while it left my senses free to a more than usual degree of activity. Things must have gone on in this way for a good hour or more, when I made the sudden discovery that there was something unusual in the conditions of our environment. This sounds a roundabout mode of expression, but I really know not how else to put it. The discovery almost rushed upon me. By rights, we were two men waiting in an alleged haunted barn for something to happen, and as two men who trusted one another implicitly, though for very different reasons, there should have been two minds keenly alert, with the ordinary senses in active cooperation. Some slight degree of nervousness, too, there might also have been, but beyond this, nothing. It was therefore with something of dismay that I made the sudden discovery that there was something more, and something that I ought to have noticed very much sooner than I actually did notice it. The fact was, Shorthouse's stream of talk was wholly unnatural. He was talking with a purpose. He did not wish to be cornered by my questions, true, but he had another and a deeper purpose still, and it grew upon me, as an unpleasant deduction from my discovery, that this strong, cynical, unemotional man by my side was talking, and had been talking all this time, to gain a particular end. And this end, I soon felt clearly, was to convince himself. But of what? For myself, as the hours wore on towards midnight, I was not anxious to find the answer, but in the end it became impossible to avoid it, and I knew as I listened that he was pouring forth this steady stream of vivid reminiscences of travel, South Seas, big game, Russian exploration, women, adventures of all sorts, because he wished the past to reassert itself to the complete exclusion of the present. He was taking his precautions. He was afraid. I felt 100 things once this was clear to me, but none of them more than the wish to get up at once and leave the barn. If Shorthouse was afraid already, what in the world was to happen to me in the long hours that lay ahead? I only know that in my fierce efforts to deny to myself the evidence of his partial collapse, the strength came that enabled me to play my part properly, and I even found myself helping him by means of animated remarks upon his stories, and by more or less judicious questions. I also helped him by dismissing from my mind any desire to inquire into the truth of his former experience. And it was good I did so, for had he turned it loose on me, with those great powers of convincing description that he had at his command, I verily believe that I should never have crawled from that barn alive. So, at least, I felt at the moment. It was the instinct of self-preservation, and it brought sound judgment. Here, then, at least with different motives reached to by opposite ways, we were both agreed upon one thing, namely, that temporarily we would forget. Fools we were, for a dominant emotion is not so easily banished, and we were forever recurring to it in 100 ways direct and indirect. A real fear cannot be so easily trifled with, and while we toyed on the surface with thousands and thousands of words, mere words, our subconscious activities were steadily gaining force, and would before very long have to be properly acknowledged. We could not get away from it. At last, when he had finished the recital of an adventure which brought him near enough to a horrible death, I admitted that in my uneventful life, I had never yet been face to face with a real fear. It slipped out inadvertently, and of course without intention, but the tendency in him at the time was too strong to be resisted. He saw the loophole and made for it full tilt. It is the same with all the emotions, he said. The experiences of others never give a complete account. Until a man has deliberately turned and faced for himself the fiends that chase him down the years, he has no knowledge of what they really are or of what they can do. Imaginative authors may write, moralists may preach, and scholars may criticize, but they are dealing all the time in a coinage of which they know not the actual value. Their listener gets a sensation, but not the true one. Until you have faced these emotions, he went on, with the same race of words that had come from him the whole evening, and made them your own, your slaves, you have no idea of the power that is in them. Hunger, that shows lights beckoning beyond the grave. Thirst, that fills with mingled ice and fire. Passion, love, loneliness, revenge, and... He paused for a minute, and though I knew we were on the brink, I was powerless to hold him. And fear, he went on, fear. I think that death from fear, or madness from fear, must sum up in a second of time the total of all the most awful sensations it is possible for a man to know. Then you have yourself felt something of this fear, I interrupted. For you said just now, I do not mean physical fear, he replied, for that is more or less a question of nerves and will, and it is imagination that makes men cowards. I mean an absolute fear, a physical fear one might call it, that reaches the soul and withers every power one possesses. He said a lot more, for he, too, was wholly unable to stem the torrent once it broke loose. But I have forgotten it. Or rather, mercifully I did not hear it, for I stopped my ears and only heard the occasional words when I took my fingers out to find if he had come to an end. In due course he did come to an end, and there we left it, for I then knew positively what he already knew, that somewhere here in the night, and within the walls of this very barn where we were sitting, there was waiting something of dreadful malignancy and of great power, something that we might both have to face ere morning, and something that he had already tried to face once and failed in the attempt. The night wore slowly on, and it gradually became more and more clear to me that I could not dare to rely, as at first, upon my companion, and that our positions were undergoing a slow process of reversal. I thank heaven this was not borne in upon me too suddenly, and that I had at least the time to readjust myself somewhat to the new conditions. Preparation was possible, even if it was not much, and I sought by every means in my power to gather up all the shreds of my courage, so that they might together make a decent rope that would stand the strain when it came. The strain would come, that was certain, and I was thoroughly well aware, though for my life I cannot put into words the reasons for my knowledge, that the massing of the material against us was proceeding somewhere in the darkness with determination and a horrible skill besides. Shorthouse, meanwhile, talked without ceasing. The great quantity of hay opposite, or straw, I believe it actually was, seemed to deaden the sound of his voice, but the silence, too, had become so oppressive that I welcomed his torrent and even dreaded the moment when it would stop. I heard, too, the gentle ticking of my watch. Each second uttered its voice and dropped away into a gulf, as if starting on a journey whence there was no return. Once a dog barked somewhere in the distance, probably on the lower farm, and once an owl hooted close outside, and I could hear the swishing of its wings as it passed overhead. Above me, in the darkness, I could just make out the outline of the barn, sinister and black, the rows of rafters stretching across from wall to wall like wicked arms that pressed upon the hay. Shorthouse, deep in some involved yarn of the South Seas that was meant to be full of cheer and sunshine, and yet only succeeded in making a ghastly mixture of unnatural coloring, seemed to care little whether I listened or not. He made no appeal to me, and I made one or two quite irrelevant remarks which passed him by and proved that he was merely uttering sounds. He, too, was afraid of the silence. I fell to wondering how long a man could talk without stopping. Then it seemed to me that these words of his went falling into the same gulf where the seconds dropped, only they were heavier and fell faster. I began to chase them. Presently one of them fell much faster than the rest, and I pursued it and found myself almost immediately in a land of clouds and shadows. They rose up and enveloped me, pressing on the eyelids. It must have been just here that I actually fell asleep, somewhere between 12 and 1 o'clock, because as I chased this word at tremendous speed through space, I knew that I had left the other words far, very far behind me, till at last I could no longer hear them at all. The voice of the storyteller was beyond the reach of hearing, and I was falling with ever-increasing rapidity through an immense void. A sound of whispering roused me. Two persons were talking under their breath close beside me. The words in the main escaped me, but I caught every now and then bitten-off phrases and half-sentences, to which, however, I could attach no intelligible meaning. The words were quite close, at my very side in fact, and one of the voices sounded so familiar that curiosity overcame dread, and I turned to look. I was not mistaken. It was Shorthouse whispering. But the other person, who must have been just a little beyond him, was lost in the darkness and invisible to me. It seemed then that Shorthouse at once turned up his face and looked at me, and, by some means or other that caused me no surprise at the time, I easily made out the features in the darkness. They wore an expression I had never seen there before. He seemed distressed, exhausted, worn out, and as though he were about to give in after a long mental struggle. He looked at me, almost beseechingly, and the whispering of the other person died away. "They're at me," he said. I found it quite impossible to answer. The words stuck in my throat. His voice was thin, plaintive, almost like a child's. "I shall have to go. I'm not as strong as I thought. They'll call it suicide, but, of course, it's really murder." There was real anguish in his voice, and it terrified me. A deep silence followed these extraordinary words, and I somehow understood that the other person was just going to carry on the conversation. I even fancied I saw lips shaping themselves just over my friend's shoulder, when I felt a sharp blow in the ribs and a voice, this time a deep voice, sounded in my ear. I opened my eyes, and the wretched dream vanished. Yet it left behind it an impression of a strong and quite unusual reality. "Do try not to go to sleep again," he said sternly. "You seem exhausted. Do you feel so?" There was a note in his voice I did not welcome, less than alarm, but certainly more than mere solicitude. "I do feel terribly sleepy all of a sudden," I admitted, ashamed. "So you may," he added very earnestly, "but I rely on you to keep awake, if only to watch. You have been asleep for half an hour at least, and you were so still, I thought I'd wake you." "What?" I asked, for my curiosity and nervousness were altogether too strong to be resisted. "Do you think we are in danger?" "I think they are about here now. I feel my vitality going rapidly. That's always the first sign. You'll last longer than I. Remember. Watch carefully." The conversation dropped. I was afraid to say all I wanted to say. It would have been too unmistakably a confession, and intuitively I realized the danger of admitting the existence of certain emotions until positively forced to. But presently Shorthouse began again. His voice sounded odd, and as if it had lost power. It was more like a woman's or a boy's voice than a man's, and recalled the voice in my dream. "I suppose you got a knife?" he asked. "Yes, a big clasp knife, but why?" He made no answer. "You don't think a practical joke likely? No one suspects we're here," I went on. Nothing was more significant of our real feelings this night than the way we toyed with words and never dared more than to skirt the things in our mind. "It's just as well to be prepared," he answered evasively. "Better be quite sure. See which pocket it's in, so as to be ready." I obeyed mechanically and told him. But even this scrap of talk proved to me that he was getting further from me all the time in his mind. He was following a line that was strange to me, and as he distanced me, I felt that the sympathy between us grew more and more strained. He knew more. It was not that I minded so much, but that he was willing to communicate less. And in proportion as I lost his support, I dreaded his increasing silence. Not of words, for he talked more volubly than ever, and with a fiercer purpose, but his silence in giving no hint of what he must have known to be really going on the whole time. The night was perfectly still. Shorthouse continued steadily talking, and I jogged him now and again with remarks or questions in order to keep awake. He paid no attention, however, to either. About 2 in the morning, a short shower fell, and the drops rattled sharply on the roof like shot. I was glad when it stopped, for it completely drowned all other sounds and made it impossible to hear anything else that might be going on. Something was going on, too, all the time, though for the life of me, I could not say what. The outer world had grown quite dim. The house party, the shooters, the billiard room, and the ordinary daily incidents of my visit. All my energies were concentrated on the present, and the constant strain of watching, waiting, listening was excessively telling. Shorthouse still talked of his adventures, in some eastern country now, and less connectedly. These adventures, real or imaginary, had quite a savor of the Arabian Nights, and did not by any means make it easier for me to keep my hold on reality. The lightest weight will affect the balance under such circumstances, and in this case the weight of his talk was on the wrong scale. His words were very rapid, and I found it overwhelmingly difficult not to follow them into that great gulf of darkness where they all rushed and vanished. But that, I knew, meant sleep again. Yet it was strange I should feel sleepy when at the same time all my nerves were fairly tingling. Every time I heard what seemed like a step outside or a movement in the hay opposite, the blood stood still for a moment in my veins. Doubtless, the unremitting strain told upon me more than I realized, and this was doubly great now that I knew Shorthouse was a source of weakness instead of strength, as I had counted. Certainly, a curious sense of languor grew upon me more and more, and I was sure that the man beside me was engaged in the same struggle. The feverishness of his talk proved this, if nothing else. It was dreadfully hard to keep awake. But this time, instead of dropping into the gulf, I saw something come up out of it. It reached our world by a door in the side of the barn furthest from me, and it came in cautiously and silently and moved into the mass of hay opposite. There for a moment, I lost it, but presently I caught it again higher up. It was clinging like a great bat to the side of the barn. Something trailed behind it. I could not make out what. It crawled up the wooden wall and began to move out along one of the rafters. A numb terror settled down all over me as I watched it. The thing trailing behind, it was apparently a rope. The whispering began again just then, but the only words I could catch seemed without meaning. It was almost like another language. The voices were above me, under the roof. Suddenly, I saw signs of active movement going on just beyond the place where the thing lay upon the rafter. There was something else up there with it. Then followed, panting, like the quick breathing that accompanies effort, and the next minute a black mass dropped through the air and dangled at the end of the rope. Instantly, it all flashed upon me. I sprang to my feet and rushed headlong across the floor of the barn. How I moved so quickly in the darkness I do not know, but even as I ran, it flashed in my mind that I should never get at my knife in time to cut the thing down, or else that I should find it had been taken from me. Somehow or other, the goddess of dreams knows how, I climbed up by the hay bales and swung out along the rafter. I was hanging, of course, by my arms, and the knife was already between my teeth, though I had no recollection of how it got there. It was open. The mass, hanging like a side of bacon, was only a few feet in front of me, and I could plainly see the dark line of rope that fastened it to the beam. I then noticed for the first time that it was swinging and turning in the air, and that as I approached it seemed to move along the beam, so that the same distance was always maintained between us. The only thing I could do, for there was no time to hesitate, was to jump at it through the air and slash at the rope as I dropped. I seized the knife with my right hand, gave a great swing of my body with my legs, and leaped forward at it through the air. Horrors! It was closer to me than I knew, and I plunged full into it, and the arm with the knife missed the rope and cut deeply into some substance that was soft and yielding. But as I dropped past it, the thing had time to turn half its width so that it swung round and faced me, and I could have sworn as I rushed past it through the air that it had the features of Shorthouse. The shock of this brought the vile nightmare to an abrupt end, and I woke up a second time on the soft hay bed to find that the gray dawn was stealing in and that I was exceedingly cold. After all, I had failed to keep awake, and my sleep, since it was growing light, must have lasted at least an hour. A whole hour off my guard. There was no sound from Shorthouse, to whom, of course, my first thoughts turned. Probably his flow of words had ceased long ago, and he too had yielded to the persuasions of the seductive god. I turned to wake him and get the comfort of companionship for the horror of my dream, when to my utter dismay, I saw that the place where he had been was vacant. He was no longer beside me. It had been no little shock before to discover that the ally in whom lay all my faith and dependence was really frightened, but it is quite impossible to describe the sensations I experienced when I realized he had gone altogether and that I was alone in the barn. For a minute or two my head swam, and I fell a prey to a helpless terror. The dream, too, still seemed half real, so vivid had it been. I was thoroughly frightened, hot and cold by turns, and I clutched the hay at my side in handfuls, and for some moments had no idea in the world what I should do. This time, at least, I was unmistakably awake, and I made a great effort to collect myself and face the meaning of the disappearance of my companion. In this I succeeded so far that I decided upon a thorough search of the barn, inside and outside. It was a dreadful undertaking, and I did not feel at all sure of being able to bring it to a conclusion, but I knew pretty well that unless something was done at once, I should simply collapse. But when I tried to move, I found that the cold and fear, and I know not what else unholy besides, combined to make it almost impossible. I suddenly realized that a tour of inspection, during the whole of which my back would be open to attack, was not to be thought of. My will was not equal to it. Anything might spring upon me any moment from the dark corners, and the growing light was just enough to reveal every movement I made to any who might be watching. For even then, and while I was still half-dazed and stupid, I knew perfectly well that someone was watching me all the time with the utmost intentness. I had not merely awakened. I had been awakened. I decided to try another plan. I called to him. My voice had a thin, weak sound, far away and quite unreal, and there was no answer to it. Hark, though, there was something that might have been a very faint voice near me. I called again, this time with greater distinctness. Shorthouse, where are you? Can you hear me? There certainly was a sound, but it was not a voice. Something was moving. It was someone shuffling along, and it seemed to be outside the barn. I was afraid to call again, and the sound continued. It was an ordinary sound enough, no doubt, but it came to me just then as something unusual and unpleasant. Ordinary sounds remain ordinary only so long as one is not listening to them. Under the influence of intense listening, they become unusual, portentous, and therefore extraordinary. So, this common sound came to me as something uncommon, disagreeable. It conveyed, too, an impression of stealth, and with it there was another, a slighter sound. Just at this minute the wind bore faintly over the field the sound of the stable clock, a mile away. It was 3 o'clock, the hour when life's pulses beat lowest, when poor souls lying between life and death find it hardest to resist. Vividly, I remember this thought crashing through my brain with the sound of thunder, and I realized that the strain on my nerves was nearing the limit, and that something would have to be done at once if I was to reclaim my self-control at all. When thinking over afterwards the events of this dreadful night, it has always seemed strange to me that my second nightmare, so vivid in its terror and its nearness, should have furnished me with no inkling of what was really going on all this while, and that I should not have been able to put two and two together or have discovered sooner than I did what this sound was and where it came from. I can well believe that the vile scheming which lay behind the whole experience found it an easy trifle to direct my hearing amiss, though, of course, it may equally well have been due to the confused condition of my mind at the time and to the general nervous tension under which I was undoubtedly suffering. But whatever the cause for my stupidity at first in failing to trace this sound to its proper source, I can only say here that it was with a shock of unexampled horror that my eye suddenly glanced upwards and caught sight of the figure moving in the shadows above my head among the rafters. Up to this moment I had thought that it was somebody outside the barn, crawling round the walls till it came to a door, and the rush of horror that froze my heart when I looked up and saw that it was Shorthouse creeping stealthily along a beam is something altogether beyond the power of words to describe. He was staring intently down upon me, and I knew at once that it was he who had been watching me. This point was, I think, for me, the climax of feeling in the whole experience. I was incapable of any further sensation, that is, any further sensation in the same direction. But here the abominable character of the affair showed itself most plainly, for it suddenly presented an entirely new aspect to me. The light fell on the picture from a new angle, and galvanized me into a fresh ability to feel when I thought a merciful numbness had supervened. It may not sound a great deal in the printed letter, but came to me almost as if it had been an extension of consciousness, for the hand that held the pencil suddenly touched, in with ghastly effect of contrast, the element of the ludicrous. Nothing could have been worse just then. Shorthouse, the masterful spirit, so intrepid in the affairs of ordinary life, whose power increased rather than lessened in the face of danger. This man, creeping on hands and knees along a rafter in a barn at 3 o'clock in the morning, watching me all the time as a cat watches a mouse. Yes, it was distinctly ludicrous, and while it gave me a measure with which to gauge the dread emotion that causes aberration, it stirred somewhere deep in my interior the strings of an empty laughter. One of those moments, then, came to me that are said to come sometimes under the stress of great emotion, when in an instant the mind grows dazzlingly clear. An abnormal lucidity took the place of my confusion of thought, and I suddenly understood that the two dreams which I had taken for nightmares must really have been sent me, and that I had been allowed for one moment to look over the edge of what was to come. The good was helping, even when the evil was most determined to destroy. I saw it all clearly now. Shorthouse had overrated his strength. The terror inspired by his first visit to the barn, when it had failed, had roused the man's whole nature to win, and he had brought me to divert the deadly stream of evil. That he had again underrated the power against him was apparent as soon as he entered the barn, and his wild talk and refusal to admit what he felt were due to this desire not to acknowledge the insidious fear that was growing in his heart. But at length it had become too strong. He had left my side in my sleep, had been overcome himself, perhaps, first in his sleep, by the dreadful impulse. He knew that I should interfere, and with every movement he made, he watched me steadily, for the mania was upon him, and he was determined to hang himself. He pretended not to hear me calling, and I knew that anything coming between him and his purpose would meet the full force of his fury, the fury of a maniac, of one, for the time being, truly possessed. For a minute or two, I sat there and stared. I saw then for the first time that there was a bit of rope trailing after him, and that this was what made the rustling sound I had noticed. Shorthouse, too, had come to a stop. His body lay along the rafter like a crouching animal. He was looking hard at me. That whitish patch was his face. I can lay claim to no courage in the matter, for I must confess that in one sense I was frightened almost beyond control. But at the same time the necessity for decided action, if I was to save his life, came to me with an intense relief. No matter what animated him for the moment, Shorthouse was only a man. It was flesh and blood I had to contend with, and not the intangible powers. Only a few hours before I'd seen him cleaning his gun, smoking his pipe, knocking the billiard balls about with very human clumsiness, and the picture flashed across my mind with the most wholesome effect. Then I dashed across the floor of the barn and leaped upon the hay bales as a preliminary to climbing up the sides to the first rafter. It was far more difficult than in my dream. Twice I slipped back into the hay, and as I scrambled up for the third time, I saw that Shorthouse, who thus far had made no sound or movement, was now busily doing something with his hands upon the beam. He was at its further end, and there must have been fully 15 feet between us. Yet I saw plainly what he was doing. He was fastening the rope to the rafter. The other end, I saw, was already round his neck. This gave me at once the necessary strength, and in a second I had swung myself onto a beam, crying aloud with all the authority I could put into my voice. "You fool, man! What in the world are you trying to do? Come down at once." My energetic actions and words combined had an immediate effect upon him, for which I blessed heaven. For he looked up from his horrid task, stared hard at me for a second or two, and then came wriggling along like a great cat to intercept me. He came by a series of leaps and bounds, and at an astonishing pace, and the way he moved somehow inspired me with a fresh horror, for it did not seem the natural movement of a human being at all, but more, as I've said, like that of some lithe wild animal. He was close upon me. I had no clear idea of what exactly I meant to do. I could see his face plainly now. He was grinning cruelly. The eyes were positively luminous, and the menacing expression of the mouth was most distressing to look upon. Otherwise, it was the face of a chalk man, white and dead, with all the semblance of the living human drawn out of it. Between his teeth he held my clasp knife, which he must have taken from me in my sleep, and with a flash I recalled his anxiety to know exactly which pocket it was in. "Drop that knife," I shouted at him, "and drop after it yourself. Don't you dare to stop me," he hissed, the breath coming between his lips across the knife that he held in his teeth. "Nothing in the world can stop me now. I have promised, and I must do it. I can't hold out any longer." "Then drop the knife, and I'll help you," I shouted back in his face. "I promise." "No use," he cried, laughing a little. "I must do it, and you can't stop me." I heard a sound of laughter, too, somewhere in the air behind me. The next second Shorthouse came at me with a single bound. To this day, I cannot quite tell how it happened. It is still a wild confusion and a fever of horror in my mind. But from somewhere I drew more than my usual allowance of strength, and before he could well have realized what I meant to do, I had his throat between my fingers. He opened his teeth, and the knife dropped at once, for I gave him a squeeze he need never forget. Before, my muscles had felt like so much soaked paper. Now they recovered their natural strength, and more besides. I managed to work ourselves along the rafter until the hay was beneath us, and then, completely exhausted, I let go my hold and we swung round together and dropped onto the hay, he clawing at me in the air even as we fell. The struggle that began by my fighting for his life ended in a wild effort to save my own, for Shorthouse was quite beside himself and had no idea what he was doing. Indeed, he has always averred that he remembers nothing of the entire night's experiences after the time when he first woke me from sleep. A sort of deadly mist settled over him, he declares, and he lost all sense of his own identity. The rest was a blank until he came to his senses under a mass of hay with me on the top of him. It was the hay that saved us, first by breaking the fall, and then by impeding his movements so that I was able to prevent his choking me to death. The wood of the dead. One summer, in my wanderings with a knapsack, I was at luncheon in the room of a wayside inn in the western country, when the door opened and there entered an old rustic who crossed close to my end of the table and sat himself down very quietly in the seat by the bow window. We exchanged glances, or, properly speaking, nods, for at the moment I did not actually raise my eyes to his face, so concerned was I with the important business of satisfying an appetite gained by tramping 12 miles over a difficult country. The fine warm rain of 7 o'clock which had since risen in a kind of luminous mist about the treetops, now floated far overhead in a deep blue sky, and the day was settling down into a blaze of golden light. It was one of those days peculiar to Somerset and North Devon, when the orchards shine and the meadows seem to add a radiance of their own, so brilliantly soft are the colorings of grass and foliage. The innkeeper's daughter, a little maiden with a simple country loveliness, presently entered with a foaming pewter mug, inquired after my welfare, and went out again. Apparently she had not noticed the old man sitting in the settle by the bow window, nor had he, for his part, so much as once turned his head in our direction. Under ordinary circumstances, I should probably have given no thought to this other occupant of the room, but the fact that it was supposed to be reserved for my private use, and the singular thing that he sat looking aimlessly out of the window, with no attempt to engage me in conversation, drew my eyes more than once somewhat curiously upon him, and I soon caught myself wondering why he sat there so silently, and always with averted head. He was, I saw, a rather bent old man in rustic dress, and the skin of his face was wrinkled like that of an apple. Corduroy trousers were caught up with a string below the knee, and he wore a sort of brown fustian jacket that was very much faded. His thin hand rested upon a stoutish stick. He wore no hat and carried none, and I noticed that his head, covered with silvery hair, was finely shaped and gave the impression of something noble. Though rather piqued by his studied disregard of my presence, I came to the conclusion that he probably had something to do with the little hostel and had a perfect right to use this room with freedom, and I finished my luncheon without breaking the silence, and then took the settle opposite to smoke a pipe before going on my way. Through the open window came the scents of the blossoming fruit trees. The orchard was drenched in sunshine, and the branches danced lazily in the breeze. The grass below fairly shone with white and yellow daisies, and the red roses climbing in profusion over the casement mingled their perfume with the sweetly penetrating odor of the sea. It was a place to dawdle in, to lie and dream away a whole afternoon, watching the sleepy butterflies and listening to the chorus of birds which seemed to fill every corner of the sky. Indeed, I was already debating in my mind whether to linger and enjoy it all instead of taking the strenuous pathway over the hills, when the old rustic in the settle opposite suddenly turned his face towards me for the first time and began to speak. His voice had a quiet, dreamy note in it that was quite in harmony with the day and the scene, but it sounded far away, I thought, almost as though it came to me from outside where the shadows were weaving their eternal tissue of dreams upon the garden floor. Moreover, there was no trace in it of the rough quality one might naturally have expected, and now that I saw the full face of the speaker for the first time, I noted with something like a start that the deep, gentle eyes seemed far more in keeping with the timbre of the voice than with the rough and very countrified appearance of the clothes and manner. His voice set pleasant waves of sound in motion towards me, and the actual words, if I remember rightly, were, "You are a stranger in these parts? Or is not this part of the country strange to you?" There was no "sir," nor any outward and visible sign of the deference usually paid by real country folk to the town-bred visitor, but in its place a gentleness, almost a sweetness, a polite sympathy that was far more of a compliment than either. I answered that I was wandering on foot through a part of the country that was wholly new to me, and that I was surprised not to find a place of such idyllic loveliness marked upon my map. "I've lived here all my life," he said, with a sigh, "and am never tired of coming back to it again." "Then you no longer live in the immediate neighborhood?" "I have moved," he answered briefly, adding after a pause in which his eyes seemed to wander wistfully to the wealth of blossoms beyond the window. "But I'm almost sorry, for nowhere else have I found the sunshine lie so warmly, the flowers smell so sweetly, or the winds and streams make such tender music." His voice died away into a thin stream of sound that lost itself in the rustle of the rose leaves climbing in at the window, for he turned his head away from me as he spoke and looked out into the garden. But it was impossible to conceal my surprise, and I raised my eyes in frank astonishment on hearing so poetic an utterance from such a figure of a man, though at the same time realizing that it was not in the least inappropriate, and that, in fact, no other sort of expression could have properly been expected from him. "I'm sure you are right," I answered at length. when it was clear he had ceased speaking. Or there is something of enchantment here, of real fairy-like enchantment. That makes me think of the visions of childhood days before one knew anything of. I had been oddly drawn into his vein of speech, some inner force compelling me. But here the spell passed, and I could not catch the thoughts that had a moment before opened a long vista before my inner vision. To tell you the truth, I concluded lamely, the place fascinates me, and I am in two minds about going further. Even at this stage, I remember thinking it odd that I should be talking like this with a stranger whom I met in a country inn, for it has always been one of my failings that as strangers my manner is brief to surliness. It was as though we were figures meeting in a dream, speaking without sound, obeying laws not operative in the everyday working world, and about to play with a new scale of space and time perhaps. But my astonishment passed quickly into an entirely different feeling when I became aware that the old man opposite had turned his head from the window again, and was regarding me with eyes so bright they seemed almost to shine with an inner flame. His gaze was fixed upon my face with an intense ardor, and his whole manner had suddenly become alert and concentrated. There was something about him I now felt for the first time that made little thrills of excitement run up and down my back. I met his look squarely, but with an inward tremor. "Stay, then, a little while longer," he said in a much lower and deeper voice than before. "Stay, and I will teach you something of the purpose of my coming." He stopped abruptly. I was conscious of a decided shiver. "You have a special purpose, then, in coming back?" I asked, hardly knowing what I was saying. "To call away someone," he went on in the same thrilling voice, "someone who is not quite ready to come, but who is needed elsewhere for a worthier purpose." There is a sadness in his manner that mystified me more than ever. "You mean?" I began, with an unaccountable access of trembling. "I have come for someone who must soon move, even as I have moved." He looked me through and through with a dreadfully piercing gaze, but I met his eyes with a full, straight stare, trembling though I was, and I was aware that something stirred within me that had never stirred before, though for the life of me I could not have put a name to it or have analyzed its nature. Something lifted and rolled away. For one single second, I understood clearly that the past and the future exist actually side by side in one immense present, that it was I who moved to and fro among shifting protean appearances. The old man dropped his eyes from my face, and the momentary glimpse of a mightier universe passed utterly away. Reason regained its sway over a dull, limited kingdom. "Come tonight," I heard the old man say. "Come to me tonight into the wood of the dead. Come at midnight." Involuntarily, I clutched the arm of the settle for support, for I then felt that I was speaking with someone who knew more of the real things that are and will be than I could ever know while in the body, working through the ordinary channels of sense. And this curious half-promise of a partial lifting of the veil had its undeniable effect upon me. The breeze from the sea had died away outside, and the blossoms were still. A yellow butterfly floated lazily past the window. The song of the birds hushed. I smelt the sea. I smelt the perfume of heated summer air rising from fields and flowers, the ineffable sense of June and of the long days of the year. And with it, from countless green meadows beyond, came the hum of myriad summer life, children's voices, sweet pipings, and the sound of water falling. I knew myself to be on the threshold of a new order of experience, of an ecstasy. Something drew me forth with a sense of inexpressible yearning towards the being of this strange old man in the window seat. And for a moment I knew what it was to taste a mighty and wonderful sensation and to touch the highest pinnacle of joy I have ever known. It lasted for less than a second and was gone, but in that brief instant of time the same terrible lucidity came to me that had already shown me how the past and future exist in the present, and I realized and understood that pleasure and pain are one and the same force. For the joy I had just experienced included also all the pain I ever had felt or ever could feel. The sunshine grew to dazzling radiance, faded, passed away. The shadows paused in their dance upon the grass, deepened a moment, and then melted into air. The flowers of the fruit trees laughed with their little silvery laughter as the wind sighed over their radiant eyes the old, old tale of its personal love. Once or twice a voice called my name. A wonderful sensation of lightness and power began to steal over me. Suddenly the door opened and the innkeeper's daughter came in. By all ordinary standards, hers was a charming country loveliness, born of the stars and wild flowers, of moonlight shining through autumn mists upon the river and the fields. Yet by contrast with the higher order of beauty I had just momentarily been in touch with, she seemed almost ugly. How dull her eyes, how thin her voice, how vapid her smile, and insipid her whole presentment. For a moment she stood between me and the occupant of the window seat while I counted out the small change for my meal and for her services. But when, an instant later, she moved aside, I saw that the settle was empty and that there was no longer anyone in the room but our two selves. This discovery was no shock to me. Indeed, I had almost expected it, and the man had gone just as a figure goes out of a dream, causing no surprise and leaving me as part and parcel of the same dream without breaking a continuity. But as soon as I had paid my bill and thus resumed in very practical fashion the thread of my normal consciousness, I turned to the girl and asked her if she knew the old man who had been sitting in the window seat and what he had meant by the wood of the dead. The maiden started visibly, glancing quickly round the empty room, but answering simply that she had seen no one. I described him in great detail, and then, as the description grew clearer, she turned a little pale under her pretty sunburn and said very gravely that it must have been a ghost. Ghost? What ghost? Oh, the village ghost, she said quietly, coming closer to my chair with a little nervous movement of genuine alarm and adding in a lower voice, "He comes before death, they say." It was not difficult to induce the girl to talk, and the story she told me, shorn of the superstition that had obviously gathered with the years round the memory of a strangely picturesque figure, was an interesting and peculiar one. The inn, she said, was originally a farmhouse, occupied by a yeoman farmer, evidently of a superior, if rather eccentric, character, who had been very poor until he reached old age, when his son died suddenly in the colonies and left him an unexpected amount of money, almost a fortune. The old man thereupon altered no whit his simple manner of living, but devoted his income entirely to the improvement of the village and to the assistance of its inhabitants. He did this quite regardless of his personal likes and dislikes, as if one and all were absolutely alike to him, objects of a genuine and impersonal benevolence. People had always been a little afraid of the man, not understanding his eccentricities, but the simple force of this love for humanity changed all that in a very short space of time. And before he died, he came to be known as the father of the village and was held in great love and veneration by all. A short time before his end, however, he began to act queerly. He spent his money just as usefully and wisely, but the shock of sudden wealth after a life of poverty, people said, had unsettled his mind. He claimed to see things that others did not see, to hear voices, and to have visions. Evidently, he was not of the harmless, foolish, visionary order, but a man of character and of great personal force, for the people became divided in their opinions, and the vicar, good man, regarded and treated him as a special case. For many, his name and atmosphere became charged almost with a spiritual influence that was not of the best. People quoted texts about him, kept when possible out of his way, and avoided his house after dark. None understood him, but though the majority loved him, an element of dread and mystery became associated with his name, chiefly owing to the ignorant gossip of the few. A grove of pine trees behind the farm. The girl pointed them out to me on the slope of the hill. He said was the wood of the dead, because just before anyone died in the village he saw them walk into that wood, singing. None who went in ever came out again. He often mentioned the names to his wife, who usually published them to all the inhabitants within an hour of her husband's confidence, and it was found that the people he had seen enter the wood died. On warm summer nights, he would sometimes take an old stick and wander out, hatless, under the pines, for he loved this wood, and used to say he met all his old friends there, and would one day walk in there never to return. His wife tried to break him gently off this habit, but he always had his own way. And once, when she followed and found him standing under a great pine in the thickest portion of the grove, talking earnestly to someone she could not see, he turned and rebuked her very gently, but in such a way that she never repeated the experiment, saying, "You should never interrupt me, Mary, when I am talking with the others, for they teach me, remember, wonderful things, and I must learn all I can before I go to join them." This story went like wildfire through the village, increasing with every repetition, until at length everyone was able to give an accurate description of the great veiled figures the woman declared she had seen moving among the trees where her husband stood. The innocent pine grove now became positively haunted, and the title of Wood of the Dead clung naturally as if it had been applied to it in the ordinary course of events by the compilers of the Ordnance Survey. On the evening of his 90th birthday, the old man went up to his wife and kissed her. His manner was loving and very gentle, and there was something about him besides, she declared afterwards, that made her slightly in awe of him and feel that he was almost more of a spirit than a man. He kissed her tenderly on both cheeks, but his eyes seemed to look right through her as he spoke. "Dearest wife," he said, "I am saying good-bye to you, for I am now going into the Wood of the Dead, and I shall not return. Do not follow me or send to search, but be ready soon to come upon the same journey yourself." The good woman burst into tears and tried to hold him, but he easily slipped from her hands, and she was afraid to follow him. Slowly she saw him cross the field in the sunshine, and then enter the cool shadows of the grove, where he disappeared from her sight. That same night, much later, she woke to find him lying peacefully by her side in bed, with one arm stretched out towards her dead. Her story was half believed, half doubted at the time, but in a very few years afterwards it evidently came to be accepted by all the countryside. A funeral service was held to which the people flocked in great numbers, and everyone approved of the sentiment which led the widow to add the words, "The father of the village," after the usual text which appeared upon the stone over his grave. This, then, was the story I pieced together of the village ghost as the little innkeeper's daughter told it to me that afternoon in the parlor of the inn. "But you're not the first to say you've seen him," the girl concluded, "and your description is just what we've always heard. And that window, they say, was just where he used to sit and think when he was alive, and sometimes, they say, to cry for hours together." "And would you feel afraid if you had seen him?" I asked, for the girl seemed strangely moved and interested in the whole story. "I think so," she answered timidly. "Surely, if he spoke to me." "He did speak to you, didn't he, sir?" she asked after a slight pause. "He said he had come for someone." "Come for someone," she repeated. "Did he say?" she went on falteringly. "No, he did not say for whom," I said quickly, noticing the sudden shadow on her face and the tremulous voice. "Are you really sure, sir?" "Oh, quite sure," I answered cheerfully. I did not even ask him. The girl looked at me steadily for nearly a whole minute, as though there were many things she wished to tell me or to ask. But she said nothing, and presently picked up her tray from the table and walked slowly out of the room. Instead of keeping to my original purpose and pushing on to the next village over the hills, I ordered a room to be prepared for me at the inn, and that afternoon I spent wandering about the fields and lying under the fruit trees, watching the white clouds sailing out over the sea. The Wood of the Dead I surveyed from a distance, but in the village I visited the stone erected to the memory of the father of the village, who was thus, evidently, no mythical personage, and saw also the monuments of his fine, unselfish spirit. The schoolhouse he built, the library, the home for the aged poor, and the tiny hospital. That night, as the clock in the church tower was striking 11:30, I stealthily left the inn and crept through the dark orchard and over the hayfield in the direction of the hill whose southern slope was clothed with the Wood of the Dead. A genuine interest impelled me to the adventure, but I also was obliged to confess to a certain sinking in my heart as I stumbled along over the field in the darkness, for I was approaching what might prove to be the birthplace of a real country myth, and a spot already lifted by the imaginative thoughts of a considerable number of people into the region of the haunted and ill-omened. The inn lay below me, and all round it the village clustered in a soft black shadow unrelieved by a single light. The night was moonless, yet distinctly luminous, for the stars crowded the sky. The silence of deep slumber was everywhere, so still indeed that every time my foot kicked against a stone, I thought the sound must be heard below in the village and waken the sleepers. I climbed the hill slowly, thinking chiefly of the strange story of the noble old man who had seized the opportunity to do good to his fellows the moment it came his way, and wondering why the causes that operate ceaselessly behind human life did not always select such admirable instruments. Once or twice a night bird circled swiftly over my head, but the bats had long since gone to rest, and there was no other sign of life stirring. Then, suddenly, with a singular thrill of emotion, I saw the first trees of the wood of the dead rise in front of me in a high black wall. Their crests stood up like giant spears against the starry sky, and though there was no perceptible movement of the air on my cheek, I heard a faint, rushing sound among their branches as the night breeze passed to and fro over their countless little needles. A remote, hushed murmur rose overhead and died away again almost immediately. For in these trees the wind seems to be never absolutely at rest, and on the calmest day there is always a sort of whispering music among their branches. For a moment I hesitated on the edge of this dark wood and listened intently. Delicate perfumes of earth and bark stole out to meet me. Impenetrable darkness faced me. Only the consciousness that I was obeying an order, strangely given, and including a mighty privilege, enabled me to find the courage to go forward and step in boldly under the trees. Instantly the shadows closed in upon me, and something came forward to meet me from the center of the darkness. It would be easy enough to meet my imagination halfway with fact, and say that a cold hand grasped my own and led me by invisible paths into the unknown depths of the grove. But at any rate, without stumbling and always with the positive knowledge that I was going straight towards the desired object, I pressed on confidently and securely into the wood. So dark was it that, at first, not a single starbeam pierced the roof of branches overhead, and as we moved forward side by side, the trees shifted silently past us in long lines, row upon row, squadron upon squadron, like the units of a vast, soundless army. And at length, we came to a comparatively open space where the trees halted upon us for a while, and, looking up, I saw the white river of the sky beginning to yield to the influence of a new light that now seemed spreading swiftly across the heavens. "It is the dawn coming," said the voice at my side that I certainly recognized, but which seemed almost like a whispering from the trees, "and we are now in the heart of the wood of the dead." We seated ourselves on a moss-covered boulder and waited the coming of the sun. With marvelous swiftness, it seemed to me, the light in the east passed into the radiance of early morning, and when the wind awoke and began to whisper in the tree tops, the first rays of the risen sun fell between the trunks and rested in a circle of gold at our feet. "Now, come with me," whispered my companion in the same deep voice, "for time has no existence here, and that which I would show you is already there." We trod gently and silently over the soft pine needles. Already the sun was high over our heads, and the shadows of the trees coiled closely about their feet. The wood became denser again, but occasionally we passed through little open bits where we could smell the hot sunshine and the dry, baked pine needles. Then, presently, we came to the edge of the grove, and I saw a hayfield lying in the blaze of day, and two horses basking lazily with switching tails in the shafts of a laden hay wagon. So complete and vivid was the sense of reality that I remember the grateful realization of the cool shade where we sat and looked out upon the hot world beyond. The last pitchfork had tossed up its fragrant burden, and the great horses were already straining in the shafts after the driver, as he walked slowly in front with one hand upon their bridles. He was a stalwart fellow, with sunburned neck and hands. Then, for the first time, I noticed, perched aloft upon the trembling throne of hay, the figure of a slim young girl. I could not see her face, but her brown hair escaped in disorder from a white sunbonnet, and her still browner hands held a well-worn hay rake. She was laughing and talking with the driver, and he, from time to time, cast up at her ardent glances of admiration, glances that won instant smiles and soft blushes in response. The cart presently turned into the roadway that skirted the edge of the wood where we were sitting. I watched the scene with intense interest and became so much absorbed in it that I quite forgot the manifold, strange steps by which I was permitted to become a spectator. "Come down and walk with me," cried the young fellow, stopping a moment in front of the horses and opening wide his arms. "Jump, and I'll catch you." Oh, she laughed, and her voice sounded to me as the happiest, merriest laughter I had ever heard from a girl's throat. Oh, that's all very well. But remember, I'm queen of the hay, and I must ride. Then I must come and ride beside you," he cried, and began at once to climb up by way of the driver's seat. But, with a peal of silvery laughter, she slipped down easily over the back of the hay to escape him, and ran a little way along the road. I could see her quite clearly, and noticed the charming, natural grace of her movements, and the loving expression in her eyes as she looked over her shoulder to make sure he was following. Evidently, she did not wish to escape for long, certainly not forever. In 2 strides the big, brown swain was after her, leaving the horses to do as they pleased. Another second, and his arms would have caught the slender waist and pressed the little body to his heart. But, just at that instant, the old man beside me uttered a peculiar cry. It was low and thrilling, and it went through me like a sharp sword. He had called her by her own name, and she had heard. For a second she halted, glancing back with frightened eyes. Then, with a brief cry of despair, the girl swerved aside and dived in swiftly among the shadows of the trees. But the young man saw the sudden movement and cried out to her passionately, "Not that way, my love. Not that way. It's the wood of the dead." She threw a laughing glance over her shoulder at him, and the wind caught her hair and drew it out in a brown cloud under the sun. But the next minute she was close beside me, lying on the breast of my companion, and I was certain I heard the words repeatedly uttered with many sighs. "Father, you called, and I have come. And I come willingly, for I am very, very tired, at any rate." So the words sounded to me, and mingled with them, I seemed to catch the answer in that deep, thrilling whisper I already knew. "And you shall sleep, my child, sleep for a long, long time, until it is time for you to begin the journey again." In that brief second of time, I had recognized the face and voice of the innkeeper's daughter. But the next minute, a dreadful wail broke from the lips of the young man, and the sky grew suddenly as dark as night. The wind rose and began to toss the branches about us, and the whole scene was swallowed up in a wave of utter blackness. Again the chill fingers seemed to seize my hand, and I was guided by the way I had come to the edge of the wood, and crossing the hayfield still slumbering in the starlight, I crept back to the inn and went to bed. A year later, I happened to be in the same part of the country, and the memory of the strange summer vision returned to me with the added softness of distance. I went to the old village and had tea under the same orchard trees at the same inn. But the little maid of the inn did not show her face, and I took occasion to inquire of her father as to her welfare and her whereabouts. Married, no doubt. I laughed, but with a strange feeling that clutched at my heart. "No, sir," replied the innkeeper sadly, "not married, though she was just going to be but dead. She got a sunstroke in the hayfields just a few days after you were here, if I remember rightly, and she was gone from us in less than a week." And that concludes part 1 of The Empty House and Other Ghost Stories by Algernon Blackwood. But the chills are not over yet. There's more to come in part 2, where we uncover even more eerie and unsettling tales. Make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next part. If you enjoyed this audiobook, don't forget to like and comment on your favorite story so far. See you soon in part 2, if you dare.